It begins with the sound of wind over empty plains, the kind of wind that has been there for thousands of years, lifting grains of sand and silt from the same riverbanks where the first cities once stood. You can almost hear it as you imagine yourself standing in the ruins of ancient Sumer, where broken walls of mud brick crumble under the weight of time. The air is dry, but it tastes faintly of earth and old stories. Beneath your feet, in this quiet place, lies the dust of civilizations whose names were once whispered with reverence, and among them, one name still seems to shimmer faintly in the background of human history: the Anunnaki. Their name appears in the oldest written language we know, etched into clay tablets with the careful strokes of cuneiform scribes more than 4,000 years ago. To the people of Sumer, the Anunnaki were not just gods. They were judges, architects, lawgivers, and sometimes destroyers. They were the ones who shaped the fate of humankind, who decided who would live and who would perish. At least that is how the stories tell it. And yet, if you strip away the piety, the offerings, the prayers, you are left with something stranger. Accounts of beings who looked like us, walked among us, and yet were not us. Tonight, as you listen, I want you to consider this quietly unsettling question. What if they were not just the symbols of a rich mythology, but the memory of something that really happened? What if the oldest stories in human history are not simply allegories, but fragments of encounters with something, or someone, not from here? Of course, historians will tell you the Anunnaki are purely mythic, a pantheon of deities invented to explain the forces of nature, the rise and fall of kings, and the human need for order in a chaotic world. They'll point to the temple records, the religious rites, and the poetic epics, and they'll remind you that humans have been creating gods since we learned to tell stories. And they might be right. But sometimes the oldest stories hold kernels of truth so well hidden that even the passage of millennia can't erase them. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. I'm not here to give you answers wrapped in neat little bows. I'm here to lead you through shadowed corridors of history where the floor creaks under your feet, where a fragment of clay with 3 lines of text can change everything you thought you knew. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you are in the world right now and what time it is for you. I like knowing who's wandering these ruins with me, no matter how far away you are. Now picture this. Somewhere in Iraq, in the lands once called Mesopotamia, a farmer's plough catches on something buried. It's not stone exactly, more like a baked brick. He brushes the dirt away, and there, in neat wedge-shaped symbols, are the words of a scribe who lived before the pyramids were even dreamed of. Sometimes such finds end up in local museums, sometimes they disappear into private collections. But the stories on those tablets are not gone. They tell of the Anunnaki as if they were living presences, arriving, giving commands, demanding gold, wheat or livestock, instructing kings in matters of law, and then vanishing again into realms above. One authoritative fact stands out here. The earliest known reference to the Anunnaki appears in the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld, where they are described as judges. That's not just poetry, it's part of the formal religious canon of Sumer around 2100 BCE. The fact that these beings are treated not as distant cosmic abstractions, but as concrete decision-makers is unusual for a pantheon. And then there's the odd detail, something almost tossed aside in translation. In some myths, the Anunnaki are said to number in the hundreds, and to move in groups, descending from the sky, or emerging from the Abzu, the subterranean waters of creation. Gods usually don't have crowd control problems. Armies do. Expeditions do. Could these phrases have been echoes of organised arrivals, the memory of landings or gatherings that were later clothed in divine language? Historians are still debating whether these images were meant as literal descriptions or symbolic shorthand for natural phenomena, like rain clouds rolling in or stars emerging at night. Here's where the first hypothesis quietly takes shape. Imagine that somewhere in our deep past, humanity had contact with an advanced non-human civilization. The encounter was not equal. We were the children in the room, they the adults. They arrived, perhaps for reasons we cannot know, perhaps for resources, perhaps to guide us, perhaps by accident. They stayed long enough to leave their fingerprints on our myths, our languages, our monuments, and then they left, or withdrew, or faded into the shadows of history. Over time, memory became myth, and myth became religion. But the ground in Sumer still holds the evidence of something that refuses to fit neatly into any single explanation. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of tablets, but by some estimates, that's only a fraction of what was once written. The rest, the full version of the human story, may still be buried. Every time a construction crew digs a new foundation in Iraq, they run the risk of striking history itself, and every so often a tablet emerges with a fragment that doesn't fit the official narrative, a scrap that hints at the Anunnaki not as distant cosmic ideals, but as tangible presences walking among brick streets and market stalls. Close your eyes and think about this. In the world's first cities, under the lamplight of sesame oil flames, there were people who could say, without irony, "I saw the Anunnaki." To them, it was as normal as saying, "I saw the governor," or "I saw the merchant." Their temples rose toward the sky like stairways, and perhaps, in the dark hours, something descended those stairways that was not entirely of this earth. It's easy to dismiss such visions as the fever dream of a pre-scientific age, and perhaps that's all they are. But the temptation to believe there is more, to think the Anunnaki were real in some sense beyond the metaphor, remains stubborn. Maybe it's because the story feels older than Sumer, older than writing itself, as though the idea had been carried down through uncounted generations, like a half-remembered lullaby from before history began. And so, here we stand, at the edge of those old riverbanks, peering back into a time when humanity was still learning how to plant fields and make bricks, yet was already telling stories of beings who could cross the sky. Whether they were gods, visitors, or the grand invention of poetic minds, the Anunnaki have left a trace too deep to ignore, and this is only the first footprint we'll follow. The path ahead winds through temple courts, across deserts, down into the darkness of buried chambers, and into questions that may never be fully answered. You can almost picture them, can't you? Tall figures striding through the dust of Sumerian streets, their garments shimmering in the low light, their eyes reflecting something neither entirely human nor entirely divine. In the cuneiform records, the Anunnaki are never just abstract shapes in the clouds. They are described as moving among people, speaking to them, even punishing or rewarding them. The tablets don't paint them as unreachable spirits. They make them feel uncomfortably close, as if a conversation with one could happen at the market or in the shadow of a ziggurat. Archaeologists have found delicate cylinder seals, small carved stones used to stamp clay, that depict scenes so strange they almost seem out of place in the Bronze Age. In one, a figure sits on a throne with an elaborate horned headdress, attended by other figures who approach in a careful procession. The central figure is sometimes assumed to be a god, but the level of human-like detail is startling. The folds of the clothing, the way the hands are positioned, the specific arrangement of their sandals. These aren't the vague shapes of a storm or the symbolic image of a river. These are portraits. One authoritative fact to keep in mind. In Sumerian iconography, the horned crown was a sign of divinity. Yet the beings who wore it often appeared entirely human in form. There's no half-animal hybrid here, no wings or claws like you might find in later mythologies. Instead, there is the suggestion of a physical presence so similar to us that the difference had to be marked with regalia. And here's the odd fact, something tucked into a few inscriptions that rarely makes it into mainstream history books. In some descriptions, the Anunnaki are said to eat and drink alongside humans, not symbolically, not in the manner of gods accepting offerings, but in shared feasts with references to bread, dates, beer, and roasted meats. It's almost a domestic image, the kind that suggests a shared table, rather than a distant altar. Gods in most cultures consume the essence of food through ritual. They don't sit down for a casual meal. The presence of such details makes you wonder, were the scribes simply using familiar imagery to make their deities more relatable, or were they preserving some memory of an actual shared existence? Historians are still debating whether these accounts should be read as literal depictions or as literary devices. It's here that another hypothesis blooms in the shadows. If the Anunnaki were real, perhaps they didn't rule from untouchable palaces of light, but walked among the people they influenced. They could have been leaders, advisors, or even military overseers whose authority was absolute. So absolute that over generations their memory hardened into godhood. The description of them judging disputes could fit either a divine role or that of human rulers backed by overwhelming power. In temple inscriptions they are described as those who decree the fates of men. That phrase echoes through time, heavy with meaning. To decree fate could mean simply to decide the outcome of political disputes, to assign land, or to grant titles. Or it could mean something more literal, the power to alter lives in ways beyond human comprehension. We don't know, but the words carry weight, and they were carved into clay for a reason. If you were there, in one of the early cities along the Tigris or Euphrates, what would it have been like to see these figures? Imagine the sound of reed flutes drifting from a courtyard, the smell of baked bread, the murmur of voices in the warm evening, and then the sudden silence that falls as a small group enters the square. No one bows entirely, but they keep their eyes lowered. The air feels thicker somehow. Someone whispers a name, one of the Anunnaki, and the presence of that name is enough to change the mood of the night. We know from historical records that Mesopotamian kings often claimed divine sanction for their rule, tracing their lineage back to gods. But in the case of Sumer, the separation between god and ruler seems thinner than in most places. The Anunnaki are described as kings themselves, not just as patrons of kings. They presided over councils, issued commands, and handed down judgments in disputes, just as a human ruler would. This blending of roles is where fact and speculation begin to blur. It's possible, and perhaps likely, that the Anunnaki were entirely the invention of human culture, anthropomorphized deities designed to mirror the political structure of the cities they ruled. But if they were based on actual figures, outsiders who came into Sumer with advanced knowledge, imposing their systems and laws, then the myths could be something more like historical records wrapped in the protective cloak of religion. Consider the architecture that rose under their names. The temples, or Ziggurats, were not just places of worship. They were centers of administration, trade, and even astronomy. Priests recorded the movements of the stars from these towering structures, keeping meticulous track of celestial cycles. Was this merely for ritual purposes, or could it have been practical knowledge passed down from beings who understood the sky in ways that early humans did not? The cylinder seals often show the Anunnaki seated before stylized objects that resemble star maps or celestial diagrams. To the casual eye, they are decorative. To someone looking for patterns, they might be clues. One seal in particular, found in Sippar, has been interpreted by some alternative researchers as depicting the solar system, including a mysterious 12th body beyond Pluto. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as a coincidence of artistic arrangement, but the idea has captured the public imagination for decades. Picture yourself leaning over a table in a dimly lit room, examining one of these seals under a magnifying lens. The tiny grooves hold a story so old that the clay has hardened into stone. Did the artisan who carved it know what they were depicting, or were they simply following a tradition handed down through generations, its original meaning long forgotten? It's this uncertainty that keeps the Anunnaki both rooted in and untethered from history. Every artifact is an anchor to the real world, but the stories wrapped around them drift freely through the realm of myth. Perhaps that's why they persist in the imagination. They belong to both worlds. In the quiet hours, when the museum lights are low and the security guards walk their rounds, the display cases of Mesopotamian artifacts take on an almost eerie presence. The carved figures seem to watch, the etched symbols catching faint reflections of light. Somewhere in that silence is the echo of the streets where the Anunnaki supposedly walked. It's not proof, not in the sense historians demand, but it's the kind of presence that lingers in the mind, just enough to make you wonder what would happen if you turned your head quickly, as though expecting someone tall, robed, and ancient to be standing just behind you. And so, the image of the Anunnaki as beings who walked like men, who spoke, ate, judged, and ruled among the first cities, refuses to fade. Whether they were real or born entirely from the human mind, they are firmly planted in the fertile soil between memory and imagination. From there, their roots stretch forward into every culture that inherited fragments of their story, shaping myths in places far beyond the reach of the Tigris and Euphrates. Somewhere among the brittle stacks of clay tablets now resting in museum drawers is a record so strange that it reads more like a riddle than a piece of history. It is called the Sumerian King List, and to anyone encountering it for the first time, it feels almost like a work of fiction. The tablet lists the rulers of Sumer and surrounding lands, their cities, and, most bizarre of all, the lengths of their reigns. In our modern world, a long-lived monarch might rule for 50 or 60 years, but here the numbers are absurd. One king rules for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. The list moves through names and cities, sometimes noting that the kingship descended from the sky, as though leadership itself were not an invention of humans but a gift, or a command, from elsewhere. One authoritative fact about the King List is that it is a genuine ancient artifact, dated to around the early 2nd millennium BCE, though it records events and rulers stretching far deeper into the past. Archaeologists have found multiple copies, suggesting it was widely circulated and important enough to be recopied over generations. And here's the odd fact. In some versions, after describing a number of impossibly long reigns, the text breaks to mention a great flood, after which the reign lengths become much shorter and more believable. The pattern is unsettling. If you believe the mainstream interpretation, those long numbers are simply a way of expressing the greatness or divine favour of early kings. Numbers in myth are often symbolic after all. But if you look through the lens of the Anunnaki hypothesis, another possibility emerges. Those early rulers may not have been entirely human, or they may have been under the direct authority of non-human overseers, beings whose lifespan was so far beyond ours that the numbers, while shocking, were literal rather than symbolic. Historians are still debating whether these lengths should be read as exaggeration, symbolic markers, or some coded reference to cycles of time that we no longer understand. Imagine standing in one of those early cities, perhaps Eridu or Kish, during the time the King List claims the kingship descended from the sky. What would that have looked like? A bright light appearing in the heavens, a procession of strangers entering the city gates, or perhaps something less theatrical, the sudden arrival of leaders whose power was so absolute and whose origins so mysterious that the people could only explain it as a gift from above. If the Anunnaki were real, this descent could have been literal, not in the poetic sense of heavenly favour, but in the physical sense, beings arriving from somewhere beyond, bringing with them a concept of kingship, law, and administration that would shape human society for millennia. To a pre-literate people, the only way to explain such an event was to say it came from the gods. Even within a strictly historical framework, the King List is strange. It names cities that have been verified archaeologically, yet it places them in a time frame that defies our understanding of early civilization. Some of the rulers named in the list are not mentioned anywhere else, while others appear in myths and epics that blur the line between human and divine. Consider the possibility that those long reigns represent more than mere kingship. Perhaps they mark periods of direct Anunnaki control, eras when the overseers themselves, or their chosen hybrids, ruled without interruption. Then, after the Great Flood, whatever that event truly was. The control shifted, and human kings began ruling on their own, albeit under the lingering influence of their former masters. The flood, as mentioned in the king list, is worth pausing on. It doesn't describe it in detail, simply marking it as a turning point. But the same flood appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later in the biblical account of Noah. The recurrence of this motif across cultures has led to endless speculation about whether it refers to an actual global or regional catastrophe, perhaps triggered by climate change, a comet impact, or, as some fringe theorists suggest, a deliberate intervention by the Anunnaki themselves. Picture the change. Before the flood, rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, their reigns dropped to hundreds, then to decades. It is as if something broke the old system, severing the connection between humanity and its sky kings. Could this have been the point when the Anunnaki left, or withdrew to a less visible role? The king list also offers an interesting clue in the phrase, "After kingship descended from the sky, it was in Eridu." Eridu is one of the oldest cities in southern Mesopotamia, and archaeological digs there have uncovered temples that predate even the earliest urban settlements elsewhere in the world. These temples are not crude. They show evidence of planned architecture, complex religious life, and a surprising degree of organisation for such an early period. Could Eridu have been the first seat of Anunnaki governance? And then there is the question of those long lives. Could humans ever live tens of thousands of years? From a biological standpoint, no, not without intervention. But if the beings in question were not human, or were genetically altered, such lifespans might be plausible. Some researchers have suggested that the reign lengths could correspond to cycles of celestial bodies. For example, a year, not meaning 365 days, but a longer astronomical cycle known to the Anunnaki. If their timekeeping was different, then our translation of their reigns into Earth years may be misleading. You might imagine for a moment the throne room of such a ruler. It would be nothing like the gilded palaces of later empires. It might be a high, cool hall of mud brick, with reed mats covering the floor and a roof supported by wooden beams. At the far end, a figure sits on a raised platform, their face shadowed by a tall headdress. They are flanked by attendants who watch you closely, and when the ruler speaks, their voice carries a weight that is not just authority. It is the weight of someone who has seen centuries, perhaps millennia, pass without aging as you do. If that image feels like fantasy, remember that the king list treats these rulers as part of the historical record, not as mythical beings. They have names, reigns, cities, and successors. They are presented as part of the same sequence as later kings whose existence we can verify through archaeology. The blending of the verifiable with the impossible is what makes the document so compelling and so frustrating. For the orthodox scholar, the king list is a mixture of myth and propaganda, a way to legitimize later rulers by tying them to a glorious semi-divine past. For the alternative historian, it is a record of a time when something extraordinary walked among us, when kingship was not invented here but delivered, quite literally or from above. And perhaps that is why the king list still draws people in. It is both an artifact and a challenge. It asks you to decide what you believe. Are these absurd numbers the product of poetic imagination, or are they the cracked and faded remnants of a truth too strange to survive unaltered? Somewhere, perhaps in a storage room behind a museum display, there may be other copies of the list, or earlier versions we have not yet seen. Perhaps they are more detailed, more explicit about where these rulers came from and what happened to them. Until they are found, we have only these names and numbers, and the phrase that still hangs in the air, kingship descended from the sky. If the king list tells us that kingship descended from the sky, then perhaps the Ziggurats of Mesopotamia were the stairways meant to meet it halfway. These stepped temples still rise above the desert, their weathered bricks catching the low sun, their silhouettes recalling the first age of cities. They were not simply places of worship. They were, in the minds of the people, literal mountains of the gods. A ziggurat was never built casually. Each layer of sun-dried brick rested on the work of hundreds of labourers. Its sides sloped gently, guiding the eye upward to a platform or shrine at the summit. From there, the priest could offer sacrifices, prayers and rituals to the Anunnaki, or so the temple records suggest. The architecture itself mimicked the idea of connection. Earth at the base, sky at the top. One authoritative fact: the best preserved ziggurat is at Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE. Archaeologists have reconstructed parts of it, allowing visitors to walk the very staircases that once led to the temple of Nanna, the moon god. And yet, the term ziggurat comes from the Akkadian Zigguratu, meaning to rise high, or to be built on a raised area, an indication that their purpose was as much symbolic as it was functional. Here's the odd fact that lingers in the background. Some Sumerian inscriptions describe these high places as locations where the gods descend and ascend. This phrasing has been interpreted by mainstream historians as poetic, a metaphor for divine presence during rituals. But in alternative readings, the language takes on a startling literalness. What if descend and ascend was not about spiritual visitation, but about physical arrival and departure? Historians are still debating whether such wording is purely ceremonial or if it reflects an older, more concrete tradition. Imagine being there in Ur when the ziggurat was new. The brickwork gleams in the sun, still sharp at the edges, the coloured glaze reflecting shades of blue and gold. Incense rises from the upper platform, curling into the warm air. You stand among the crowd in the courtyard below, craning your neck as figures in elaborate robes climb the stairways. The priests say the Anunnaki will arrive. People murmur, some look to the sky. From a purely architectural perspective, the ziggurat is a marvel of early engineering. It's not hollow, it's a solid mass of brick layered for stability, with a temple only at the top. There are no inner chambers to explore, no hidden tunnels, at least not in the surviving examples. But the flat summit invites speculation. Was it only for rituals? Or could it have been a platform for something more unusual? Fringe theorists, inspired by the ancient astronaut hypothesis, have suggested that ziggurats might have served as landing platforms for the Anunnaki, not for spaceships as we picture them now, but for whatever vehicles they might have used to descend. In this view, the priests at the summit were not just offering food to invisible gods, but welcoming the return of their skyborn patrons. Mainstream scholars push back against this. The platforms, they say, were far too small to serve any practical purpose other than ceremonial. And yet, one might counter that if the Anunnaki were real, their craft might not have been the massive machines of modern science fiction. They could have been smaller, more precise, needing only a stable, elevated place to make contact. Interestingly, the Sumerians associated ziggurats with specific deities, and those deities often had strong celestial associations. The ziggurat of Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon god. The one at Uruk was linked to Anu, the sky god. These links between towering structures and the heavens might be entirely religious, or they might be cultural memories of real meetings between sky and earth. Consider also the deliberate placement of ziggurats. They were often aligned with cardinal directions or celestial events. At certain times of year, the sun would rise or set in perfect alignment with the stairways or temple facade. This suggests an understanding of astronomy that goes beyond mere agricultural necessity. If the Anunnaki were instructors of human knowledge, as some myths claim, then perhaps these alignments were not just symbolic but instructional, teaching humans to track time, seasons, and cosmic cycles. One tablet fragment from Ur describes the temple at the top of the ziggurat as a house whose head touches the sky. The wording sounds poetic, but it's also curious. Why emphasize physical contact with the sky unless there was a tradition that something tangible descended there? In a world without mountains nearby, the ziggurat was the closest humans could get to the heavens without leaving the ground. Picture the view from the top. The city stretches below in neat rectangles of mud brick homes. Canals glint in the sunlight, carrying water from the Euphrates. Beyond the walls lies the flat sweep of desert. At night the stars are so bright they seem close enough to touch. If the Anunnaki did come, this is where they would have been seen first, descending from the constellations, their arrival watched by the priests who kept vigil on the summit. The hypothesis that ziggurats were contact points raises another question. If the Anunnaki had the ability to descend anywhere, why choose these man-made structures? Perhaps it was about ceremony, the act of humans building something monumental as a sign of devotion or readiness. Or perhaps it was about practicality, the high platforms serving as beacons or stable surfaces for whatever technology was involved. Even if you set aside the extraterrestrial angle, the ziggurat remains a profound symbol of human ambition. It is an act of reaching upward, of meeting the divine halfway. In that sense, the ziggurat is not just a building but a declaration. We are ready to meet those above us. Some archaeologists believe that earlier versions of ziggurats were simple raised platforms, possibly for keeping temples safe from floods. Over time, these grew more elaborate, their symbolism layered with new meanings. But if the earliest platforms were already connected to the idea of divine descent, then the architectural evolution could be read as a long-term preparation for contact, either with gods or with the beings later remembered as gods. There's also the practical matter of visibility. A ziggurat dominates the skyline of its city. If you were approaching from a distance, whether on foot or from the air, you would see it long before you saw the city walls. It would act as a marker, a wayfinder. If the Anunnaki returned at intervals, perhaps these structures were built to ensure they always had a recognizable point of entry. And then there is the quiet, lingering possibility that the rituals conducted on those summits were not just prayers, but exchanges. Offerings left not for invisible consumption, but for actual retrieval. A loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a vessel of beer. Not symbolic gifts, but provisions for guests who came from far away. Whether you view them as altars or as ancient airports, the ziggurats of Sumer remain stubbornly enigmatic. They are too large, too carefully placed, too deeply woven into the mythology of descent and ascent to dismiss entirely as simple temples. Perhaps, like much of the Anunnaki story, they served more than one purpose, sacred to the people, functional to the visitors, and so the stairways still climb toward the sky, even in ruin. Their steps are worn, their bricks eroded, but their purpose, whatever it truly was, remains suspended between history and myth, waiting for those willing to climb and look out over the desert, toward the horizon where the next arrival might appear. The ziggurats may have been the meeting places, but the stories carved into clay tell us something more intimate. The Anunnaki were not a single united will. They argued, they schemed, and among their most enduring divisions was the tension between two names, Enki and Enlil. In the myths, Enlil is the stern, commanding figure, the one who holds authority over earth and sky, the one who decrees destinies without flinching. Enki, by contrast, is the clever one, the bringer of knowledge, the god of the Abzu, the subterranean waters of creation. If Enlil is the law, Enki is the loophole. One authoritative fact: in the Enuma Elish and other Mesopotamian texts, Enlil is often credited with creating order from chaos, establishing the structures of society and enforcing divine decrees. Enki, meanwhile, is the patron of wisdom, crafts and mischief, the one who intervenes to help humanity when the higher councils decide on destruction. This is not just a symbolic split between two aspects of divinity. It is an ongoing narrative of conflict between control and compassion. Here's the odd fact. In the flood story preserved on the Atrahasis epic, it is Enlil who grows tired of the noise of humanity and decides to wipe them out, while Enki secretly warns Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh version, instructing him to build a boat and save life on Earth. It is an ancient version of the whistleblower, one authority figure undermining the decision of another for reasons of conscience or strategy. Historians are still debating whether these opposing roles reflect real political factions within the temple priesthoods, or if they preserve some memory of genuine conflict among leaders whose origins are lost to us. If you frame the Anunnaki not as gods but as advanced beings, the Enki and Enlil divide begins to look like a political rivalry. Imagine a group of outsiders arriving in a young human civilization. Some see humanity as useful but dangerous, too noisy, too chaotic, needing strict control. Others see humanity as capable of growth, worth teaching, worth protecting. Both perspectives could exist within the same group, creating a tension that shapes the fate of the people under their influence. In Sumerian art and text, Enlil is often associated with the air, storms, and the power to grant kingship. His temple at Nippur was a political and spiritual centre, a place where decisions affecting the whole region could be made. Enki's domain was the Abzu, a mythical freshwater ocean beneath the earth, but also a metaphor for deep hidden knowledge. His primary cult centre was at Eridu, one of the oldest cities in the world. The geographic separation mirrors the mythic split. Enlil's power is central, official, tied to the capital. Enki's is peripheral, older, and more secretive. Picture yourself in Eridu at dusk. The air is heavy with the scent of reeds and the slow, damp breath of the marshes. The temple to Enki stands on a raised platform, smaller than the towering ziggurats of later cities, but older, its bricks darkened by centuries. Priests tend small lamps along the water channels that feed into the Abzu's symbolic pools. Here, you might hear whispered prayers not for order and authority, but for guidance in craft, in healing, in cleverness. The kind of help that comes quietly, without the thunder of decrees. The myths tell us that Enki gave humanity the arts of civilization, how to farm, how to build, how to measure the heavens. If you accept the Anunnaki as visitors hypothesis, this reads almost like a transfer of technology. Enki is the teacher, slipping forbidden knowledge into human hands, while Enlil would have preferred to keep it locked away. And then there is the flood itself, a breaking point between these two forces. In the story, Enlil calls for humanity's destruction, citing their overpopulation and constant noise as intolerable. It's an oddly specific complaint, the sort of detail that suggests an actual grievance rather than a symbolic one. Enki, defying the council, warns Atrahasis through the reed wall of his house, speaking to the wall so he cannot be accused of directly betraying the divine order. This loophole in divine law feels human in its cunning, but in the myth it is the act of a god, or perhaps of a leader with enough autonomy to take dangerous risks. If the Anunnaki were indeed real, this schism could have had tangible effects on early Mesopotamian life. Cities loyal to Enlil might have been more rigid, hierarchical, and politically centralized, while those aligned with Enki might have fostered more innovation, trade, and independent thinking. Over centuries, the rivalry could have shaped the cultural and technological landscape of the region. In some later traditions, this tension is softened, even erased. Enki and Enlil appear together in rituals, both as honoured members of the pantheon. But the older stories, the ones etched into the earliest tablets, preserve the friction. You can almost feel the strain between the lines, as though the scribes themselves were aware of a history that couldn't be fully spoken in the official versions. The rivalry even touches on the human origin myths. In certain Sumerian accounts, humanity is created at the behest of the gods to relieve them of labour. In others, Enki plays a direct role in fashioning humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. This version, oddly visceral, suggests a belief in a physical process, not a divine snap of the fingers, but a craft, an experiment. If Enki was the patron of such work, perhaps it reflects a faction within the Anunnaki that saw humanity not as an accident but as a deliberate creation. Imagine the council chamber of the Anunnaki, a long narrow hall lit by oil lamps, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and bitumen. Enlil sits at the head, his voice sharp and decisive. Enki leans back, eyes thoughtful, speaking rarely but with precision. Around them are other figures, some nodding to Enlil's calls for order, others glancing toward Enki with the faintest smile of agreement. Outside in the cities, the people wait for decisions that could shape the course of their lives for generations. In this light, the Enki-Enlil divide is more than myth. It is the shadow of an ancient political reality, a reminder that even among those with extraordinary power, unity is fragile. And it raises an intriguing question. If the Anunnaki were real, did their disagreements over humanity contribute to their eventual disappearance from our world? The stories never tell us for certain who won in the end. Humanity survived the flood thanks to Enki's intervention, but Enlil's authority remained in the myths. Perhaps the truth is that neither side triumphed, that their rivalry was unresolved when they finally stepped back from direct contact, leaving humanity to chart its own course with the fragments of knowledge and governance they had left behind. And so, in the ruins of Nippur and Eridu, in the cracked clay tablets that bear their names, the tension between Enki and Enlil still whispers. It is a reminder that the Anunnaki, if they walked among us, were not untouchable ideals, but beings with rivalries, loyalties, and perhaps even doubts, and that their story is as much about conflict as it is about creation. If Enki was the patron of cleverness, then perhaps his greatest legacy was not a single act of defiance against Enlil, but the slow, deliberate gift of knowledge to humanity. In the myths, he is the one who teaches skills, crafts, and secrets, the sort of information that can change the destiny of a people. And whether the Anunnaki were gods, rulers, or something else entirely, the idea of gifted knowledge lingers as one of the most tantalizing threads in the whole story. The Sumerians credited their deities with the origin of agriculture, irrigation, metalworking, writing, and even the laws that bound their cities together. It is tempting to imagine these as natural human developments, the result of centuries of trial and error. And yet, in their own accounts, the Sumerians did not see it that way. They believed these skills had been given to them, already complete, by those who descended from above. One authoritative fact: the Sumerian word mi, pronounced may, refers to the divine decrees or attributes that govern all aspects of civilization. These mi include everything from truth and justice to the art of weaving, the building of cities, the performance of music, and the practice of temple rituals. In myth, Enki is the custodian of the mi, and in one famous story he transfers them, willingly or otherwise, to the goddess Inanna, who brings them to her city of Uruk. The idea is clear. Civilization is not built from scratch, but handed over like a set of tools. Here's the odd fact that makes this story stranger. In the myth, the mi are described almost like physical objects, loaded onto a boat, carried from one city to another. If this is purely symbolic, it's a curious choice, to depict knowledge and law not as ideas but as tangible cargo. Historians are still debating whether the imagery was meant to evoke the idea of sacred artifacts, or if it preserves some memory of actual physical devices associated with teaching or governance. Now imagine this in less mythic terms. If the Anunnaki were advanced beings, they might have brought not just ideas but objects, tools, devices, or models to demonstrate concepts. The mi could have been a kind of portable archive or even technological aids that allowed humans to leap forward in their capabilities. The leap from a subsistence farming village to a city-state with law codes and astronomical records is enormous. Could such leaps have been accelerated by outside intervention? Agriculture is a good place to start. The earliest Sumerian records describe complex irrigation systems, canals, and crop rotation techniques. While irrigation could certainly be developed locally, the scale and precision of some systems seemed sophisticated for their time. If Enki was the instructor, then perhaps the gift was the knowledge to harness rivers and transform arid plains into farmland that could support tens of thousands of people. The same is true for metallurgy. The Sumerians worked with copper and bronze, alloys that require not just the discovery of metals, but the understanding of smelting, alloying, and shaping. These processes involve precise control of heat and materials, the sort of thing that could take centuries to refine if starting from nothing. Yet in Mesopotamia, such skills appear fully formed in the archaeological record, as though they emerged fully operational rather than through long sequences of failed experiments. And then there is astronomy. The Sumerians tracked the movements of the moon, the sun, and the planets with remarkable accuracy. They divided the sky into recognizable constellations, created calendars, and could predict celestial events. The knowledge was practical, essential for agriculture and navigation, but it also carried a sense of reverence. Many of their deities, including the Anunnaki, were associated with celestial bodies. If these beings came from the heavens, then it makes sense that their gifts would include the mapping of those heavens. One tablet from the city of Nineveh, often referred to as the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, records the appearance and disappearance of the planet Venus over a period of 21 years. Such meticulous record-keeping suggests a long-standing tradition of observation. But how did such traditions begin? Was it human curiosity alone, or was it sparked, or even instructed, by someone who understood the sky far better than the people of Earth? Picture yourself in a small Sumerian workshop by the Euphrates, centuries before the pyramids of Egypt. A master artisan, taught by his father, who was taught by his, is working copper over an open flame. He uses tools whose designs have not changed for generations, because they work perfectly. He tells you, almost casually, that these tools were given to his ancestors by the lords who came from the sky. He doesn't mean this as a metaphor. To him, it is a matter of family history. The gift of writing is perhaps the most profound. Cuneiform begins as a system for tracking trade, storing numbers and lists, but it evolves rapidly into a means of recording myths, laws, and historical events. Writing transforms memory into permanence, allowing ideas to travel across generations. If the Anunnaki intended to shape human culture for the long term, then the ability to write would have been the ultimate tool, the key to preserving their instructions long after they were gone. Some researchers have suggested that the Sumerian language itself, with its complex structure and lack of clear relatives among other languages, could have been a planted language, one introduced fully formed. Mainstream linguistics attributes its uniqueness to the fact that it is a language isolate, a survivor from a much older linguistic family now lost to time. But to the speculative mind, the idea of a deliberately given language is tempting. The hypothesis deepens when you consider that many of the skills attributed to the Anunnaki appear in other ancient cultures, sometimes with eerily similar origin stories. In Egypt, for example, Thoth is the god who brings writing, science, and measurement. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl teaches agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomy. Across the world, there are echoes of culture bringers descending from the sky, staying just long enough to set the foundation, then disappearing. Are these parallel inventions of human imagination, or are they distant memories of a shared experience? If you were there in those early days, the gifts might not have seemed miraculous. They would have been practical, woven into daily life. The irrigation channels would bring water to your crops. The copper tools would make your work faster. The star charts would tell you when to plant and when to harvest. The great leap forward would not feel like a leap. It would feel like the natural way of things, because you had never known anything else. And yet, under the surface, there would be the quiet awareness that these things had a source, that someone, not you, not your parents, not your grandparents, had brought them here. That knowledge would become part of the city's foundation myths, and the names of those who gave it would be preserved in temple hymns. Over time, those names would be enshrined as gods, the original context fading, the gifts becoming sacred relics of a divine age. The Sumerians, in their hymns to Enki, praise him not just for his wisdom, but for his generosity, for giving without keeping all the power for himself. In contrast to Enlil's strictness, Enki's legacy is one of empowerment, and perhaps that is why, in the shadow of Ziggurats and the quiet courtyards of temples, the people spoke of him with a warmth that seems almost personal. If the Anunnaki were real, then Enki's role as a giver of knowledge might have been more than just a poetic image. It could have been the deliberate shaping of a species, preparing humanity not for worship but for independence. If Enki's gifts gave humanity the means to flourish, the flood story shows just how close we came to losing it all. Among the most famous of the Mesopotamian myths is the tale of a great deluge, one so devastating that it nearly erased the human race. And unlike many myths that live in oral tradition alone, this one survives on clay, carved in the wedge-shaped cuneiform of scribes who swore they were preserving a memory, not an invention. The most famous source is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian, which contains a detailed account of a flood that sounds suspiciously familiar to anyone who knows the biblical story of Noah. In Gilgamesh's tale, the survivor is Utnapishtim, who tells the hero how the gods decided to send a flood to wipe out humanity. The reason? Humanity had grown too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the rest of the gods. One authoritative fact. The earliest known version of the Mesopotamian flood story appears not in Gilgamesh, but in the Atrahasis epic, a text from the Old Babylonian period, around the 18th century BCE, though the story itself is thought to be far older. Here, the chief god Enlil makes the decision to destroy humankind, while Enki, ever the protector, finds a way to warn Atrahasis, instructing him to build a massive boat and take aboard animals and food supplies. And here's the odd fact. The flood story is not unique to Mesopotamia or the Hebrew Bible. Myths of a great flood appear in more than 200 cultures around the world, from the highlands of Peru to the river valleys of China. Historians are still debating whether these tales reflect independent local disasters magnified into myth, or a shared memory of a single massive event that occurred in prehistory. If the Anunnaki were real, this moment could have been a deliberate reset, an attempt to control or limit the human population after it, had grown beyond what was considered manageable. The complaint about noise in the Atrahasis text may sound strange, but perhaps noise was symbolic for something else, unrest, resistance, or activity that threatened the Anunnaki's control. Imagine the Council of the Gods, or rulers, if you prefer the less divine framing. Enlil, representing authority, calls for total erasure. His voice is steady but uncompromising. Humanity is becoming a problem, and the problem must be removed. Around the chamber, other figures remain silent, unwilling to challenge the decision. Only Enki shifts in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he calculates the risk of defying the order. The myth says that Enki spoke to the wall of Atrahasis' house, not to Atrahasis directly. This was his loophole. If accused, he could truthfully say he had not given a human any forbidden knowledge. He had simply spoken to an inanimate object. But Atrahasis, hearing through the reeds, understood the message. Build a boat, seal it with pitch, gather your family, your animals, and enough provisions to last the coming days. The instructions are remarkably specific for a myth. The boat is to be roofed over, sealed against water, and divided into sections for people and animals. Atrahasis obeys, and when the rains come, they do not stop. The waters rise over the cities, over the Ziggurats, over the fields and canals, until nothing remains but the endless dark of a drowned world. From a geological perspective, several events could fit the template of a great flood. Some researchers point to the rapid flooding of the Persian Gulf basin around 8,000 years ago, when rising post-Ice Age seas engulfed vast areas of habitable land. Others look to catastrophic river floods in Mesopotamia itself, where the Tigris and Euphrates could overflow with devastating force. But the scale of the flood in the myth, all mankind turned to clay, suggests something even more dramatic, at least in the minds of those who told it. If the Anunnaki had the capability, and if they truly saw humanity as a flawed experiment or a resource gone rogue, then triggering such an event might have been within their means. A flood could be engineered by manipulating weather, breaking dams, or even through methods we cannot imagine. Whether literal or allegorical, the story carries the same weight. Humanity's survival was not a given. It depended on the intervention of a single dissenter. Picture Atrahasis standing on the deck of his boat as the rain lashes down, the horizon gone, the air heavy with the smell of pitch and wet timber. In the distance, where there had once been lights from the city, there is only darkness and water. The cries of animals mingle with the endless sound of falling rain. He cannot know if anyone else has survived. All he can do is wait. When the waters finally recede, the survivors step onto land that feels unfamiliar. The cities are gone. The farmlands are silt-covered emptiness. It is a true beginning again, and perhaps that was the point. To wipe away the structures that had grown too fast, too far, and to start again with those who would be loyal. In the myths, Enlil is eventually reconciled to the survival of humanity, granting Atrahasis and his descendants the right to live, though with shorter lifespans and new hardships, sickness, infertility, and mortality itself. In this framing, the flood is not just a punishment, but a recalibration. The human world that emerges afterward is smaller, weaker, and more manageable. The flood story's persistence is part of what makes it so haunting. If it were simply a local Mesopotamian myth, it might have faded with the fall of those cities, but it appears in various forms across continents and millennia. Could it be that the memory of such an event was so traumatic that it was carried forward in every migrating group, reshaped to fit local landscapes but always retaining its core? And then there is the darker speculation that the flood was not only an act of destruction, but also a means of erasing evidence. If the Anunnaki had given humanity advanced knowledge or technology, destroying the centers of civilization would also destroy those records, those tools, those structures that might reveal too much. The survivors would remember the beings from the sky, but without the means to replicate their works, the knowledge would eventually sink into myth. The tablet that tells the Atrahasis story is broken, its edges worn. We do not have every word. Somewhere in the missing lines there may have been details we can only guess at now. Specific reasons for the flood, specific descriptions of what came before. But the surviving fragments are enough to keep the story alive. Enlil's decree, Enki's defiance, the building of the boat, the rain that did not stop, the silence that followed. And perhaps that is the real gift Enki gave, not just agriculture, writing, or metallurgy, but survival itself, the refusal to let humanity be erased. Without that one act, there would be no cities, no kings, no stories carved into clay, no descendants to ponder whether the beings who once ruled the earth were gods, aliens, or something else entirely. The flood receded, but the memory never did. It lingers still, in stone, in scripture, in the quiet unease that comes with rain that falls too hard for too long. If the flood was a way of erasing and restarting humanity, then we're left with an uncomfortable question. Why were the Anunnaki here at all? Myths give us the religious answer. They came because they were gods, and gods belong wherever they please. But in the alternative interpretations, a different motive emerges, one that feels far more practical and, in its own way, far more human. They came for gold. This idea doesn't appear explicitly in every ancient tablet, but it has been popularized in modern rereadings of Sumerian mythology, particularly through the work of alternative history writers who link the Anunnaki to ancient mining operations. The theory goes like this. The Anunnaki were an advanced, possibly extraterrestrial species whose homeworld needed gold for technological or atmospheric purposes. They came to Earth, found it rich in the metal, and decided to extract it. But mining is labour-intensive, and so, rather than spend centuries doing it themselves, they created or adapted humanity as a workforce. One authoritative fact: we do have archaeological evidence of ancient gold mining in parts of the world that long predate organised empires. In southern Africa, for example, there are ancient mine shafts and stone structures that have been tentatively dated by some researchers to more than 40,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology doesn't connect these directly to Mesopotamia or the Anunnaki, but the presence of early mining on such a scale is intriguing. Here's the odd fact. In certain Mesopotamian creation myths, humans are said to have been made to bear the yoke and do the work of the gods. This could mean agricultural work, temple service, or, in a more literal reading, physical labour like construction and mining. Historians are still debating whether such lines are purely metaphorical descriptions of religious duty or faint echoes of an older tradition in which humans truly did perform physical labour on behalf of their creators. If the Anunnaki were real and they came for gold, the flood story takes on an even stranger cast. Perhaps the reset wasn't just about controlling population size or noise, but about restructuring the workforce. A smaller, more manageable human population, loyal to the right faction, could serve the Anunnaki's needs more efficiently. The question, of course, is why gold? In modern times, gold is valued for its rarity, beauty, and resistance to tarnish, perfect for jewellery and currency. But it's also an exceptional conductor of electricity and highly resistant to corrosion, making it useful in electronics and aerospace applications. In the speculative version of the Anunnaki theory, gold might have been used for something even more critical, repairing or maintaining an atmosphere, either on Earth or on their homeworld. Some have proposed that microscopic gold particles could reflect or scatter harmful radiation, or stabilize an environment. Whether or not this is scientifically plausible, it provides a clear material motive for the myth's otherwise cryptic references to labouring for the gods. Picture the Mesopotamian landscape thousands of years ago. Alongside the cities with their ziggurats and temples, imagine smaller, less ceremonial sites. Work camps near riverbeds and rocky hills where gold-bearing sediments could be found. People labouring with stone tools, carrying baskets of earth, panning in streams, overseers ensuring quotas are met. To the people doing the work, the labour might have been framed as an offering to the gods, a sacred duty that would ensure the fertility of their fields and the safety of their cities. The gold itself might have been taken away without explanation. The oldest surviving records from Sumer focus more on agricultural tribute than mining, but there are tantalizing gaps. Clay tablets often list goods delivered to temples, grain, cattle, textiles, and occasionally precious metals. What's missing is the record of how much of those metals remained in Sumer and how much might have been taken elsewhere. One could argue that the myth of humans being made to serve the gods fits neatly into the economic structure of early city-states, where much of the population's labour supported an elite priesthood and royalty. But in the alternative reading, those elites might have been intermediaries, human managers for a non-human power structure. In this light, the grand temples could be both places of worship and administrative hubs for resource collection. There's another curiosity here. The association between gods and gold is not unique to Mesopotamia. In Egypt, gold was called the flesh of the gods and was reserved for divine statuary in the pharaoh's tombs. In the Andes, the Inca considered gold to be the sweat of the sun, sacred to their solar deity. Across the world, in unrelated cultures, gold appears again and again as a divine material. Could this be a coincidence of human psychology? Shiny things attract attention, or the cultural residue of a global pattern set in motion by beings who valued gold for reasons we no longer understand? If the Anunnaki did mine gold, where did it go? Was it stored in their temples, melted into artifacts? Or was it, and here's where speculation turns most radical, transported away from Earth entirely? The myths are silent on this point. They don't tell us what the gods did with the gold once it was in their possession, only that offerings and tributes were made, and that those offerings were essential to maintaining divine favour. Imagine standing at the mouth of a mine in the hills to the east, watching the last light of day turn the dust into a golden haze. The workers below are shadows in the fading sun, their tools clinking faintly. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in a temple or perhaps somewhere unreachable, the gold they've gathered will vanish into the keeping of the gods. None of them will ever see it again. Some modern proponents of the gold theory point to the Anunnaki's supposed knowledge of metallurgy and celestial mechanics as evidence of a technologically advanced culture. If they were capable of interstellar travel, they would certainly have the means to extract and process gold on a scale far beyond human capacity at the time. But this raises another question. Why Earth? If they could travel between worlds, surely they could mine gold from asteroids or uninhabited planets without the trouble of managing a human workforce. The only answer in this line of thought is that Earth's gold was unusually accessible, both in river deposits and in shallow veins, making it worth the trouble. The mainstream view, of course, is far simpler. Humans mined gold because they valued it, and myths about serving the gods are allegories for the social hierarchy of early civilizations. Gold's divine associations are the product of its rarity and enduring luster. No extraterrestrial motives are required, and yet, the phrasing in some of the oldest texts, the persistence of the association across distant cultures, and the sudden leaps in human civilization all keep the more speculative theory alive. In the end, whether the Anunnaki came for gold or not, the idea lingers because it gives the story a tangible motive. Gods who create humans for worship alone are harder to imagine in practical terms. Beings who come for a resource, who organize, manage, and sometimes cull their workforce, are all too easy to understand. That kind of pragmatism feels familiar. It feels human. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. If the Anunnaki came for gold, or for any reason that bound them to Earth for centuries, they would have lived among humans for long stretches of time, and if they lived among us, perhaps it was inevitable that the boundaries between them and us would blur. In myth, those boundaries blur in a very particular way. Bloodlines. Across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts, there are stories of unions between gods and humans, producing offspring who are neither fully divine nor entirely mortal. In some cases, these children were kings, chosen to rule with divine sanction. In others, they were heroes, warriors, or figures of exceptional wisdom. The notion is not unique to Mesopotamia. Greek mythology is filled with demigods. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim, and many indigenous traditions describe sky people who mated with humans. But in the Anunnaki narrative, the interbreeding has a more strategic tone. One authoritative fact: the Sumerian king list records not only impossibly long-lived rulers, but also kings chosen by Anu, or chosen by Enlil, suggesting that divine selection was an explicit part of political legitimacy. Kingship was not just inherited from human fathers, it could be granted through direct descent from the gods. Here's the odd fact. In some Mesopotamian texts, the offspring of gods and humans are described as physically larger or more capable than ordinary people. This echoes the biblical account in Genesis 6:4, where the sons of God take human wives and have children who become mighty men of old. Historians are still debating whether such descriptions are purely metaphorical, a way of praising the elite, or based on persistent oral traditions of people who are physically distinct. If the Anunnaki were real, then interbreeding might have served multiple purposes. It could have been a way of cementing alliances with influential human families, ensuring loyalty by linking bloodlines. It might also have been a method of introducing specific traits, intelligence, physical endurance, resistance to disease, into the human population, and it raises the possibility that some ruling families, in Sumer and beyond, claimed more than symbolic descent from their divine patrons. Picture the royal court of Uruk. The king sits on a high-backed chair, his features striking in a way that makes people whisper when they think no one is listening. His mother was said to be human, but his father's identity is a matter of careful silence, or sacred mystery. Priests bow low, not just because of his authority, but because of what they believe flows in his veins. From a biological perspective, the idea of humans interbreeding with non-human beings depends on their level of compatibility. If the Anunnaki were human-like in form and genetics, this would be conceivable. If they were not, the myths might encode something different, perhaps the adoption of foundlings, or the symbolic marriage between rulers and temple priestesses representing the gods. But in the alternative reading, the genetic link is real, and its legacy could still be with us. This theory, that certain modern human lineages might carry traces of non-human DNA, has been fed by recent advances in genetics. We now know that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, leaving measurable traces in our genome. If interbreeding with other hominin species happened, then in principle it could have happened with any other compatible species, including hypothetically the Anunnaki. Supporters of this idea sometimes point to unusual anomalies in ancient burials, skeletons with above-average height, elongated skulls, or other unusual features. Mainstream archaeology explains most of these as natural variation, binding, or deformities caused by disease. But for those inclined to believe the Anunnaki hypothesis, such remains are potential markers of ancient hybridization. Even within the Mesopotamian myths, the offspring of gods and humans are often given special destinies. Gilgamesh himself, the legendary king of Uruk, is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a genetic ratio that makes little sense unless you see it as a poetic way of describing mixed ancestry. His feats in the Epic of Gilgamesh, defeating monsters, defying the gods, seeking immortality, are the acts of someone who is more than human, yet still subject to human mortality. If you were living in Sumer and you saw such a figure, you might not question the divine lineage. His appearance, abilities, and charisma would be enough to set him apart. And because the gods, or the Anunnaki, had chosen him, his rule would feel ordained. That belief would strengthen his authority more than any army. The legacy of these bloodlines might have spread far beyond Sumer. As cities fell and empires shifted, the descendants of divine rulers could have married into other royal families, carrying their genetic, or symbolic, heritage into Egypt, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley. It's not impossible that the echoes of such unions still exist in the genealogies of later dynasties, even into the historical era we consider well documented. There's another layer to this. In some myths, the gods are said to have taken human lovers not out of political necessity, but out of desire, sometimes with disastrous results. Jealousies, rivalries, and punishments for forbidden unions appear frequently in these tales. If these stories have any basis in reality, they suggest that the relationship between Anunnaki and humans was complex, not purely functional. Emotional entanglements could have created divisions within the Anunnaki themselves, echoing the Enki and Enlil rivalry in more personal ways. Some researchers have speculated, and this is where the theory becomes more controversial, that traces of these ancient unions might still be detectable in the modern world, not just in DNA but in physical traits that persist at low frequencies. Tall stature, unusual eye colour in populations where it is rare, or even higher than average cognitive abilities are sometimes cited as evidence. Mainstream science sees no need for an Anunnaki explanation for such variation, but the persistence of the idea shows how deeply the bloodline narrative resonates. Imagine, for a moment, a hidden lineage. Families who keep careful records of their ancestry, who pass down certain traditions without ever explaining their origin to outsiders. Perhaps they preserve symbols associated with the Anunnaki, woven into jewellery or carved into private altars. Perhaps they avoid speaking openly about why their family history begins, not with a mortal ancestor, but with a name that was once carved into clay as a god. If the Anunnaki did interbreed with humans, the implications go beyond mythology. It would mean that part of what we are, part of what makes us human today, is the result of a deliberate act by beings from elsewhere. It would also mean that their influence never fully ended, because it lives on in our very cells. And if they never left entirely? If the bloodlines still matter? That possibility takes the story from the realm of ancient history into the unsettling present. In the myths, the children of gods and men were meant to rule, to lead, to preserve the connection between the two worlds. If that mandate was real, then somewhere in the quiet corners of the modern world it might still be followed. If ancient bloodlines could carry the Anunnaki legacy through the ages, then the written word might carry something even more dangerous: their instructions, their agreements, their history. We know the Sumerians wrote obsessively, cataloguing everything from grain, rations to epic poetry. Tens of thousands of clay tablets have been unearthed in Iraq and surrounding regions. But what is found is not the same as what is seen. For every tablet in a museum display case, there are others locked away in storage rooms, others broken beyond easy translation, and still others whispered about but never shown to the public. In the official narrative, this is a matter of archaeology's slow and methodical process. Excavations yield more artifacts than can be studied at once. Many end up in crates for decades while scholars work through the backlog. But in the Anunnaki debate there is another suspicion, that some tablets are deliberately withheld, either because their contents are politically sensitive, disrupt accepted history, or feed into unwelcome alternative interpretations. One authoritative fact: in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Western expeditions to Mesopotamia shipped vast quantities of artifacts back to London, Paris, Berlin, and other capitals. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets, most of which have never been fully translated or published. This backlog isn't a conspiracy. It's an immense scholarly challenge. Yet the sheer number of untranslated pieces makes it entirely possible that something paradigm-shifting could be sitting unnoticed in a drawer. Here's the odd fact. In the 1960s, a small number of tablets from the Sipper Library, thought to contain astronomical and possibly historical data, were reportedly misplaced after being sent to a foreign museum for study. They have never resurfaced. The official explanation is mundane. Artifacts sometimes go missing due to poor cataloguing, theft, or damage. But among those inclined toward the Anunnaki hypothesis, the suspicion remains that certain texts vanish for more intentional reasons. Historians are still debating whether such losses are random accidents or part of a quiet, selective filtering of history. Imagine the excavation of an ancient temple complex at Ur or Nippur. A team brushes away the dirt to reveal a sealed jar, inside of which are tablets wrapped in bitumen to protect them from moisture. The first lines mention not just offerings or temple accounts, but direct orders from a council of the gods, naming Enlil, Enki, and others. Perhaps the text speaks of a descent or arrival in terms that are disturbingly concrete. Would such a find be treated like any other tablet, catalogued, translated, published? Or would it be quietly set aside until someone higher up decides how much the world is ready to know? The suspicion that information is hidden is not unique to the Anunnaki narrative. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, were famously subject to decades of restricted access, leading to a swirl of speculation about their contents. When the full texts were eventually released, they were less sensational than many imagined, but the secrecy itself had already planted deep seeds of doubt. The same dynamic could be at work with Mesopotamian finds. The longer a tablet remains unseen, the more its imagined contents grow in the public mind. If you believe the alternative theory, the most sensitive texts would be those that describe the Anunnaki not in the language of divine metaphor, but in the dry administrative tone of a historical record. Instead of "the gods descended in glory," it might read, "The lords arrived in the city from the sky in their shining chariots, and the people bowed." Such wording, if real, would collapse the distance between myth and memory, forcing a reconsideration of how we categorize the past. There's also the possibility that some records were hidden in antiquity, long before modern archaeologists arrived. The burning of the Library of Ashurbanipal's archives is well documented, but other losses could have been deliberate concealments, caches buried under temple floors, sealed in walls, or hidden in desert caves. If the Anunnaki ever feared rebellion, dissent, or exposure, they might have ordered certain records destroyed or hidden where only trusted initiates could find them. Consider the fragments we do have. Even within the surviving corpus, There are lines that seem to glance towards something unsaid. A temple hymn might list the titles of a god, ending with a phrase like, "Keeper of the bond between heaven and earth," without explaining what that bond is. A chronicle might mention the days before the black wind, hinting at a catastrophe with no further detail. These gaps are tantalizing because they feel less like the absence of imagination and more like the absence of permission to speak. Picture yourself in the back room of a museum, the air smelling faintly of dust and old paper labels. Stacks of trays hold fragments no larger than a matchbox, each one covered in tiny marks. Some are so worn that only a skilled epigrapher can guess at their meaning. In one tray, a nearly complete tablet tells a story of the first city before the waters, and in that story the gods arrive not from the horizon but from above, bringing objects that gleam like fire. You look up at the locked door, wondering how many eyes have seen this since it was dug from the ground. The hidden records theory also ties into a larger, older suspicion that the guardians of history, whether they are curators, governments, or academic institutions, see themselves as protecting the public from destabilizing narratives. It's not always malicious. It can be paternalistic, the belief that people will misinterpret complex material or use it to fuel dangerous ideologies. But it raises the uncomfortable question of who gets to decide which truths are safe to tell. In the Anunnaki debate, this question is particularly sharp. If a text clearly described the gods as flesh and blood visitors who stayed in certain cities for certain years, it would undermine centuries of theological interpretation and potentially challenge the foundations of multiple world religions. It would also give fresh ammunition to those who argue that human civilization is not entirely our own creation. And yet, there's a more mundane explanation for the hidden records. They're not hidden at all, just buried in the avalanche of material waiting to be studied. Many cuneiform texts that could shed light on the Anunnaki are economic or legal in nature: contracts, receipts, trade lists. These might, in theory, contain casual references to the presence or actions of gods, but they're not prioritized because they seem routine. The danger, of course, is that the casual references are precisely where truth hides best. Somewhere, in a basement or a private collection, there could be a tablet that reads like a meeting log, listing the names of participants, human and otherwise, and the outcomes decided that day. It would look boring until you noticed that the otherwise are names we have always called gods. That's the kind of record that could turn the Anunnaki from myth into history in a single stroke. Until then, the hidden records remain both a physical reality and a metaphor for everything we've lost, everything we've ignored, and everything we're not yet ready to face. Whether in the back of a museum or under the sand of a ruined city, they wait. And like the gods they describe, they are silent until someone finds the right way to call them back. In the great ruins of Mesopotamia, there is a recurring image carved into stone and clay alike: a doorway. Sometimes it is framed with intricate geometric designs, sometimes flanked by figures holding strange objects, and sometimes it appears in isolation, like the outline of a door that leads nowhere. To the archaeologist, these are symbols, thresholds into sacred space, markers of a temple's sanctity, or metaphors for the passage between the mortal and the divine. But to those who follow the Anunnaki narrative, these doorways might have been something else entirely, and portals. The idea isn't as far-fetched in myth as it sounds in modern science. Across Mesopotamian literature, there are references to the gates of the gods, places where deities descend to earth or return to the heavens. In some inscriptions, the gods are said to stand at the gate of the sky, or pass through the door of the deep. Mainstream interpretation holds that these are poetic ways of describing sunrise, sunset, or seasonal changes. Yet in the alternative reading, they could be literal locations, technology disguised in symbolic form. One authoritative fact: the Babylonians built elaborate ceremonial gates for processional routes, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. Constructed during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II around 575 BCE, it was a towering blue-glazed structure decorated with lions, dragons, and bulls. It served both as a defensive structure and a ceremonial passage into the inner city. But in much older Sumerian and Akkadian art, gates often appear without the walls they would logically belong to, freestanding, almost like frames. Here's the odd fact. In some depictions, figures stand within these framed gates, holding objects that resemble rods, rings, or even mechanical devices. In later Assyrian carvings, winged beings are shown approaching these gateways with gestures that could be read as ritual or as operation. Historians are still debating whether such imagery is purely religious symbolism or a stylized memory of physical structures with functional purposes now lost to us. Imagine walking through the ruins of an ancient city. The walls have long since crumbled, but here, standing alone on the cracked stone, is a massive doorway carved from a single slab. Its lintel is worn, its sides etched with symbols that no one has fully translated. There is nothing behind it but desert, nothing before it but more ruins. And yet, when you stand before it, you feel, irrationally, that it is still waiting to be used. If the Anunnaki were real and possessed advanced technology, these Stargates could have been literal, devices for transport between locations or even between worlds. The myths of gods ascending or descending might not be metaphors for spiritual experience, but records of physical travel. The image of a gate or door is a natural way to represent such a thing to a population that has no other frame of reference. In the Sumerian descent of Inanna, the goddess passes through 7 gates to reach the underworld, surrendering a piece of her regalia at each one. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought was not a fiery pit, but a shadowy realm beneath the earth. Perhaps a memory of a subterranean complex or another kind of elsewhere entirely. Each gate in the story could be read as a symbolic step in a spiritual journey, or as checkpoints in a real passage through controlled access points. This gate imagery is not confined to Mesopotamia. Across the world, from the Gate of the Sun in Tiwanaku, Bolivia, to the stone doors of Pumapunku and the rock-cut portals in the mountains of Peru, we find the motif repeated. Massive, precisely carved frames with no apparent practical purpose. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to ceremonial architecture or incomplete construction. The Anunnaki theorists see a network, remnants of an ancient system of transit points. If such gates were real and functional, they would have been the most closely guarded structures in any city. Only the high priests, chosen officials, or the Anunnaki themselves would have been allowed to approach. Access could have been controlled through ritual, or through actual security measures disguised as ritual. The ordinary citizen, seeing a god step into a frame and vanish, would have no explanation but divine magic. The technological plausibility of such devices is, of course, highly speculative. In modern science, concepts like wormholes and quantum teleportation exist in theory but not in practice. Still, the persistence of the gate motif across ancient cultures is difficult to dismiss entirely. Why do so many civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, create the image of a door to nowhere? Why are these doors often aligned with astronomical events, as though they were meant to open only at certain times? Picture a ziggurat at dawn, its upper platform bathed in the first light of day. On that platform stands a great arch of stone, its inner edge lined with inlays of metal that gleam faintly. A robed figure approaches, carrying a small object that fits into a recess at the base. There is a sound, low, almost below hearing, and then a shimmer in the air within the arch. The figure steps forward and is gone. The shimmer fades. The crowd below kneels, not understanding what they have seen, only that the god has departed. Mainstream historians would say such a scene is pure imagination, but the language of the ancient texts leaves room for interpretation. In some hymns, the Anunnaki are praised for opening the way or removing the barrier between worlds. These could be poetic phrases for granting favour or revealing hidden truths, but they could also be poetic memories of something technological, softened by centuries of retelling. The possibility of ancient stargates ties into the idea of hidden records from Part 10. If such structures existed, the instructions for building or operating them would have been among the most closely guarded secrets in the Anunnaki's possession. It is possible that some of these instructions were recorded, and equally possible that they were among the first things destroyed or concealed when the Anunnaki departed. Even without functioning technology, the ruins of such gates could still hold symbolic power. Later civilizations might have built their own ceremonial versions, mimicking the appearance of something they no longer understood. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, for all its beauty, might be a decorative echo of an earlier, more mysterious function. Standing before a lone stone portal in the desert, the mind cannot help but wonder, was this ever more than a frame? Did it once lead somewhere? And if so, where? The answer may be buried under the sand, or it may be scattered among the fragmented lines of a tablet waiting in some museum storeroom. Until we find it, the gates remain closed, their threshold guarded by silence and time. If the Anunnaki built gates and great cities in Mesopotamia, then time has already claimed many of them. Some are buried under shifting dunes, others lie broken on the sea floor. What we see today, the ruins of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, might only be a fraction of the network of settlements and structures that once existed. The rest could still be hidden, not because no one is looking, but because they are in places we rarely think to search. In Mesopotamia, the desert is a patient thief. Over thousands of years, the wind buries walls, courtyards, and streets beneath sand that drifts like a slow tide. Archaeologists have long suspected that entire ancient cities lie concealed under the barren plains of Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria. Some have been located through satellite imagery, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Perfect rectangles and radial street patterns that nature does not create. One authoritative fact: in 2015, archaeologists using declassified spy satellite photographs discovered dozens of previously unknown sites in northern Mesopotamia, including city walls, canals, and fortifications. Many of these date to known historical periods, but others are older, their origins harder to fix. If such sites exist in the north, how many more lie in the deep south, beneath the alluvial deposits of the Tigris and Euphrates? Here's the odd fact: certain Mesopotamian texts describe cities that have never been found. They are not mythical places like Dilmun, often placed in the realm of gods, but named in administrative records alongside real, verifiable cities. Some lists even note their products, their taxes, or their temple dedications. Yet their locations are unknown. Historians are still debating whether these cities were destroyed and forgotten, renamed beyond recognition, or simply lie buried where no one has dug. If the Anunnaki were real, these missing cities could have been more than just population centres. They might have been hubs for whatever technologies or systems the Anunnaki maintained. If gates or sky platforms existed, they may have been destroyed or dismantled, their remnants scattered, and their cities abandoned to keep their secrets from later generations. And then there is the sea. During the last ice age, much of what is now the Persian Gulf was dry land, a broad, fertile basin watered by the combined flow of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin rivers. Archaeologists call it the Persian Gulf Oasis, and some believe it could have been one of the cradles of early civilization. But when the ice melted and sea levels rose, the basin flooded, drowning whatever was there. If you look at a bathymetric map of the Gulf today, you can see the ghost of an ancient river system etched into the seabed. Somewhere under that warm, shallow water could be the ruins of settlements that predate Sumer itself, perhaps even the first cities the Anunnaki built on Earth. Mainstream archaeology hasn't found such ruins yet, but marine surveys are rare in this politically sensitive region. The possibility remains that under the silt lies something we have been telling ourselves is myth. Picture a diver descending into the cloudy green water near the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab. Visibility is poor, but the seabed is littered with pottery fragments, worked, stone blocks, and something stranger. A carved lintel with symbols worn almost smooth. The diver's light catches a pattern, a star, a crescent, and a shape that could be a gate. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. Beyond the gulf, there are other drowned landscapes tied, at least in legend, to the Anunnaki. Off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Cambay, sonar surveys have revealed geometric structures beneath the sediment. Some researchers have dated them to as far back as 9,000 years ago, though this is controversial. The mainstream explanation is that these are natural formations or later constructions submerged by rising seas. Yet the alternative view sees them as evidence that advanced settlements once existed along coasts now underwater, settlements that could have been part of a much wider network. Even on dry land, there are hints of lost cities. In the deserts of Oman and the empty quarter of Arabia, satellite imagery has revealed ancient caravan routes converging on what appear to be buried structures. Could these have been way stations or outposts in an Anunnaki-controlled trade system, linking Mesopotamia to more distant colonies? The local Bedouins speak of lost cities swallowed by the sands, places where strange lights are seen at night and the wind carries voices. The forgotten cities beneath sand and sea invite a dangerous kind of speculation. If we found one, truly found one, and it contained inscriptions or artifacts that matched the earlier Sumerian styles, it could force a rethinking of human history, especially if it predated the supposed rise of civilization in Mesopotamia. The problem is that even if such places exist, proving their connection to the Anunnaki would require a leap that most archaeologists are unwilling to make, and yet, the myths are persistent. Sumerian hymns speak of Eridu, said to be the first city built by the gods, rising from the Abzu. In the physical world, Eridu's ruins lie in southern Iraq, a modest tell of mud brick layers. But the mythic Eridu is something greater, more luminous. Could the Eridu we know have been built atop the ruins of an even older city, one that has since been swallowed by water or buried beyond reach? There's also the question of deliberate burial. In some cultures, sacred sites were intentionally covered to protect them, turning temples into mounds and palaces into hills. If the Anunnaki, or their human administrators, wanted to conceal something, they could have ordered it buried under tons of earth, then planted a new city atop it. This means that some of the cities we excavate today could be sitting on top of layers we have yet to imagine. Picture an archaeologist, trowel in hand, working in the heat of a Mesopotamian afternoon. She brushes away dust from a seal impression, showing a godlike figure holding a strange device, standing beside a structure that looks nothing like the known architecture of the time. She realizes the layer she's working in is older than any city on record. Below her feet, perhaps another 10 meters down, could be an entirely different world, one that the flood, the sands, and the seas have tried their best to erase. Until we look in the right places, beneath the deserts, under the gulfs, in the deep layers under known ruins, the forgotten cities will remain only half real, half history, half ghost story. And in that half-light, they are no less powerful, because the possibility of their existence changes how we look at the cities we do know. It makes every mound and every seabed a potential doorway into a chapter of human history that we have barely begun to read. If the Anunnaki truly walked among the people of Mesopotamia, it's hard to imagine their story remaining confined to the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. Cultures trade more than goods. They trade ideas, symbols, and myths. And as merchants, migrants, and wanderers moved across deserts, mountains, and seas, pieces of the Anunnaki story could have slipped quietly into the traditions of distant civilizations. Across the ancient world, we see the same pattern. Deities who arrive from the sky or the sea, who bring laws, agriculture, astronomy, and architecture, then depart, sometimes promising to return. These are the culture bringers and god kings of countless legends, and while mainstream historians attribute the similarities to universal human storytelling, others see them as fingerprints of a shared origin. One authoritative fact: In ancient Egypt, the first rulers were said to be the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, a group that predated the pharaohs and supposedly reigned for thousands of years. Egyptian king lists sometimes begin with divine or semi-divine rulers, much like the Sumerian king list. These followers are credited with establishing agriculture along the Nile and laying the foundations of the Egyptian state. Here's the odd fact. In Mesoamerica, far from the Fertile Crescent, myths speak of Quetzalcoatl, a bearded god from the east who taught the arts of civilization before departing across the sea. In the Andes, Viracocha is described in similar terms. Both are said to have walked among humans, teaching them skills and laws. Historians are still debating whether these figures arose entirely independently or reflect faint echoes of stories carried across oceans in deep prehistory. If the Anunnaki were real, perhaps they were not bound to Mesopotamia alone. They could have been part of a wider network of contact, visiting multiple regions, adapting their names and appearances to fit the local cultures. The result would be the kaleidoscope of myths we now see, different on the surface, but sharing an underlying structure. In the Indus Valley, a sophisticated urban civilization flourished around the same time as Sumer, complete with planned cities, advanced drainage, and standardized weights and measures. Yet its script remains undeciphered. If there were Anunnaki influences there, they might still be hidden in that unreadable writing. The Harappan seals show animal motifs and human figure combinations that feel distant cousins to Mesopotamian iconography, hinting at a connection that we cannot yet prove. Consider also the myths of Polynesia, where ancestral figures are said to have come down from the stars to settle islands, bringing with them knowledge of navigation and agriculture. Or the Dogon people of Mali, who maintain a detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including the invisible companion star Sirius B, long before modern telescopes. Mainstream scholars often ascribe such knowledge to coincidence or later contact, but those who follow the Anunnaki narrative see it as the survival of teachings given long ago. Picture a merchant in 2500 BCE, leaving Ur with a caravan bound for the Levant. His cargo is copper ingots, fine textiles, and jars of date wine. But in his mind he carries stories about kings who lived for thousands of years, about gods who came from the sky, about gifts of knowledge. When he reaches a port on the Mediterranean, he trades his goods, and over a fire at night shares those stories with a local chieftain. Over generations, the details change, the names shift. But the skeleton of the tale, beings from above, teachers, rulers, vanishing into the distance, remains. In Greece, the earliest myths tell of the Golden Age, when gods walked with mortals and humanity lived in peace. This age ends with a great change, often a flood, after which the gods withdraw. The parallels to the Sumerian timeline are difficult to ignore. A long era of divine presence, followed by catastrophe, followed by a diminished human world. Even the imagery of the Anunnaki, horned crowns, winged figures, and robed human-like forms, finds echoes elsewhere. In Anatolia, the Hittites depicted their storm god with a horned helmet. In the art of pre-Columbian Central America, deities wear elaborate headdresses that to an outsider's eye resemble stylized crowns. If such motifs travelled with the stories, they could have been reinterpreted through the lens of local styles. The mechanism for this kind of diffusion doesn't require direct Anunnaki travel to every culture. Humans themselves are excellent carriers of stories. A single sailor who once served in a Mesopotamian port could carry a god's name to another coast. A scribe trained in a Sumerian city could move to another court and introduce fragments of myth into the local religion. Over centuries, the original context erodes, leaving only the shared bones of the story. This diffusion can also explain why some myths seem to be mirrors of each other. The Mayan hero twins of the Popol Vuh descend into the underworld, much like Inanna in Sumer. The Egyptian Osiris is killed, dismembered, and resurrected, not unlike the Sumerian Dumuzi. Whether these similarities are coincidence or the result of a common ancestor in myth, they suggest that ancient people were connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. If the Anunnaki were real, and their reach extended beyond Mesopotamia, their legacy might be hiding in plain sight, not in obvious artifacts, but in the persistence of themes across time and geography. Sky origin rulers, civilizing gifts, great floods, departure and promised return. Picture yourself in a temple far from Sumer, perhaps on the Nile or in the jungles of Central America. The walls are painted with figures in headdresses, holding staffs or strange objects. A priest chants a story of gods who came from beyond the horizon to teach the people how to plant, how to build, how to measure the stars. You realize that you've heard this story before, not here, but half a world away, told with different names, in a different tongue, under different stars. And yet, it is the same. The echoes of the Anunnaki, if they are echoes, are scattered but resilient. They survive the fall of empires, the loss of languages, the erosion of stone, and they whisper the possibility that our earliest civilizations were not isolated beginnings, but branches of something older and broader, a pattern that began in one place, then rippled outward until the whole ancient world was touched by the memory of those who came from the sky. If stories and symbols can travel across cultures, then language, the very tool we use to shape those stories, might be an even more enduring legacy. The Sumerians left us the oldest known written language, carved into clay in the sharp, precise lines of cuneiform. But the Sumerian language itself is a puzzle. It does not belong to any known language family. It is a linguistic orphan, an isolate, without proven relatives among the tongues of the ancient world. Mainstream linguists treat this as a curiosity, an accident of history. Languages die, and when they do, their relatives vanish with them, leaving the survivors isolated. But in the context of the Anunnaki story, the uniqueness of Sumerian takes on another shade. If the gods gave humanity not just tools and laws, but a language, then perhaps Sumerian was that gift, or that imposition. One authoritative fact: Sumerian was already a fully developed written language the first time it appears in the archaeological record, around 3100 BCE. There is no Proto-Sumerian in the surviving evidence, no gradual evolution from simpler forms. The first texts we find are administrative records and lists, already using a sophisticated system of signs. This sudden arrival is unusual. Here's the odd fact. In Sumerian mythology, the god Enki is credited with giving humans the me, the divine decrees of civilization, and language is often implied to be among them. There are also myths that speak of a time when all mankind spoke the same tongue before the gods confused their speech. Historians are still debating whether this is an early version of the Tower of Babel story or an entirely separate tradition with its own origin. If the Anunnaki were real, giving humanity a common language could have been both practical and strategic. It would allow them to communicate with their human workforce and with each other across city-states. It could also establish control. If the only way to access higher knowledge, laws, or trade systems was through a language they provided, they would remain the gatekeepers of civilization. Picture a classroom in ancient Eridu. A young scribe sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a damp clay tablet on his lap. His teacher, an older man with the creased hands of someone who has pressed thousands of wedge marks into clay, recites words in Sumerian, pausing for the boy to repeat them. These are not the words of his family's dialect. They are something older, sharper, more exact. When he writes them, the marks align in a way that feels less like drawing and more like unlocking a code. The structure of Sumerian is unusual. It is an agglutinative language, meaning that words are formed by stringing together small units of meaning, each with its own grammatical function. It has features that make it efficient for recording complex information, ideal for administration, trade, and law. If a group wanted to create a functional, adaptable written language for managing a civilization, Sumerian would fit the bill. Some researchers have even speculated that the earliest written Sumerian could have been a simplified or adapted form of a more complex original, perhaps the Anunnaki's own tongue. The symbols carved into early seals and ceremonial objects sometimes differ from standard cuneiform, as if they belong to a parallel system of writing. Could these have been remnants of a priestly or divine script, taught only to initiates? The myth of language confusion is also intriguing. In the story, humanity once spoke a single tongue, but the gods, for reasons not entirely clear, disrupted it, creating multiple languages. This could be a metaphor for the breakup of a political order, but it could also be a dim memory of a deliberate change in communication systems. If the Anunnaki wished to divide human groups, giving them separate languages would slow the spread of knowledge and make unified resistance less likely. Think about how language shapes thought. The words you have determine the concepts you can express. In Sumerian, certain terms, like those for the gods, cosmic forces and specific technologies, are precise and distinct, as if they had been defined with care. If those words were imported from elsewhere, they might carry traces of ideas or objects no longer present in the archaeological record. And then there is the curious persistence of Sumerian long after it stopped being a spoken language. By around 2000 BCE, everyday speech had shifted to Akkadian, a Semitic language. Yet Sumerian remained the language of scholarship, religion and administration for centuries, taught to scribes who no longer spoke it fluently. This echoes how Latin was used in medieval Europe as a learned language of authority and tradition. If Sumerian began as a gifted or imposed language, its survival in elite contexts makes sense. It was the language of the gods, even when the gods no longer walk the earth. Some proponents of the Anunnaki hypothesis point to linguistic anomalies, isolated words in other ancient languages that seem to have no clear etymology, but resemble Sumerian terms. These could be coincidences, but they could also be linguistic fossils, fragments of the language of the sky, embedded in otherwise unrelated tongues. Picture yourself holding a clay tablet in a museum. The wedge marks are crisp, the lines straight. You can't read them, but you can feel the intentionality in their form, the way each sign fits into the next, the way the whole is more than just marks on clay. You imagine the scribe who made it, the teacher who trained him, and the one who decided, long before either of them was born, that this was the language through which civilization would speak. If Sumerian was indeed gifted by the Anunnaki, then every surviving tablet is more than just a record of trade or law. It is a surviving fragment of their voice. And while languages die, writing can endure for thousands of years, carrying that voice across millennia. It means that even if the Anunnaki themselves are gone, a part of them, their words, their syntax, their way of thinking, is still here, pressed into clay, waiting for someone to listen. If the Sumerian language was a gift, perhaps the Anunnaki left another kind of gift as well, one not made of words but of patterns in the night sky. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamia are some that are not lists of grain or law codes but maps, star charts, planetary records, and astronomical omens. The precision of these records raises a difficult question. How could a civilization over 5,000 years ago have known so much about the heavens? One authoritative fact: the earliest known star catalogues come from Babylon, but their roots are Sumerian. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian astronomers could identify the paths of the sun, moon, and visible planets. They divided the sky into recognizable constellations, some of which are still in use today. This isn't unusual for an ancient culture, but what stands out is the degree of accuracy and the long-term records they maintained. Here's the odd fact. One particular tablet, often called the planisphere, discovered in the library of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, has been interpreted by some researchers as showing not only the constellations, but the path of an object crossing the sky that could be a comet, asteroid, or even something artificial. Mainstream scholars argue it is a record of an eclipse. Historians are still debating whether its unusual features are simply artistic, or if they indicate a more advanced observational tradition than we currently recognize. If the Anunnaki were real, and if they truly descended from the heavens, then it makes sense they would have brought detailed knowledge of the stars with them, not just for navigation, but perhaps to track alignments important to their own movements. Teaching this knowledge to their human subjects would serve practical purposes: agriculture, timekeeping, and possibly the synchronization of rituals with celestial events. Picture a Sumerian priest-astronomer standing atop a ziggurat at night. The desert air is clear and cool, the stars sharp against the black. In his hands is a smooth clay tablet, still damp enough to take an impression. He looks up, then down, pressing wedge marks to record where Venus rises and sets, how the moon's path shifts through the months. He is not guessing. He is following a tradition so old it is said to come from the gods themselves. One of the more provocative claims in the Anunnaki narrative is that the Sumerians knew of planets invisible to the naked eye. Advocates often point to a seal from Akkadian times, now housed in the Louvre, which appears to show the sun surrounded by 11 or 12 bodies. Some identify these as the known planets of our solar system, plus an extra, sometimes called Nibiru, whose existence is central to certain modern Anunnaki theories. Mainstream archaeologists interpret the seal differently, suggesting the objects are symbolic rather than literal astronomical bodies. Still, even without invoking a lost planet, Mesopotamian astronomy was advanced. They developed the concept of a 360-degree circle, divided the day into 24 hours, and could predict lunar eclipses. Their star lists include constellations both northern and southern, implying that their knowledge was cumulative and possibly inherited from earlier undocumented traditions. The idea of inherited knowledge is crucial. If early Sumerian astronomers began with a baseline of advanced understanding, it would explain the sudden sophistication in their records. In the Anunnaki hypothesis, that baseline came from their celestial patrons, perhaps even from charts of the skies beyond Earth's immediate view. Imagine finding an ancient tablet, not in the ruins of Ur or Babylon, but buried far deeper in a layer predating known civilization. On it is a map of the stars as they were not in 3000 BCE, but tens of thousands of years earlier, when the constellations were shifted by precession. Such a find would be hard to dismiss as coincidence. It would suggest an origin for the knowledge far older than the city-states of Mesopotamia. Some Mesopotamian texts link specific gods to specific stars or planets: Inanna to Venus, Nanna to the moon, Utu to the sun. These associations may seem obvious, but they go beyond simple naming. Ritual calendars were tied to the cycles of these bodies, and certain festivals could only be held when particular alignments occurred. If the Anunnaki were using these alignments for their own purposes, perhaps as navigational markers or as part of a technology we no longer understand, then the human rituals could be a shadow of a far older system. There is also the matter of orientation. Some ziggurats and temples are aligned with remarkable precision to cardinal directions or to the rising points of specific stars. In Ur, the great ziggurat's corners are aligned within a few degrees of true north, a feat that would require careful observation and mathematical skill. In the Anunnaki reading, such precision could have been necessary for more than religious symbolism. It could have been part of a grid or network stretching across multiple cities, linked to points in the sky. The link between the heavens and rulership is also telling. The Sumerian king list speaks of kingship descending from the sky, a phrase that could be poetic or literal. If leadership was tied to celestial events, perhaps the Anunnaki used the stars as a timetable for when and where they would intervene in human affairs. Picture standing in the temple courtyard during a festival. The priests have gathered, the people are quiet. The high priest points to a bright star just rising above the horizon. A horn sounds, and a proclamation is made. A new era has begun, sanctioned by the gods. To the people, this is a moment of faith. To the Anunnaki, if they were there, it might have been the completion of a calculated cycle. The persistence of Mesopotamian star knowledge into later cultures strengthens the sense of continuity. Babylonian astronomy influenced Greek thought, which in turn shaped Islamic and European astronomy. Even today, when we talk about constellations like Leo, Taurus, or Scorpio, we're using patterns that were already mapped in Sumer. This endurance is a kind of immortality. The Anunnaki, if they existed, are still with us every time we look up and name the shapes in the night sky. And yet, much remains untranslated. In museum basements and archives are astronomical tablets that few outside a small circle of scholars have read. Some might contain nothing more than seasonal omens, but others could hold details about alignments or cycles that no one has yet recognized. It is possible that, hidden in plain sight, we already have the key to understanding why the Anunnaki seem so bound to the heavens. Whether these celestial maps were human achievements or the residue of a greater knowledge, they connect us to the same sky the Sumerians saw, and perhaps to the same visitors they claim descended from it. For centuries in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the Anunnaki are everywhere, issuing decrees, teaching skills, presiding over councils, deciding the fate of kings, and then, at some point, they aren't. Their names still appear in later myths, but their presence changes. They become distant, symbolic, absent. The detailed accounts of direct interactions fade, replaced by ritual invocations and poetic praise. It is as if, in the historical record, they slowly walk out of the frame and leave humanity to its own devices. This disappearance is one of the greatest puzzles in the Anunnaki narrative. If they were real, where did they go? Did they leave entirely, or simply retreat into the shadows? And why did they choose that moment in history to step back? One authoritative fact: by the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 7th century BCE, the Anunnaki are still mentioned in religious texts, but primarily as figures of the underworld or as a collective pantheon without individual activity. In contrast, earlier Sumerian records often describe them as distinct personalities with direct influence on earthly events. The change is stark, suggesting either a shift in religious thought or a genuine loss of contact. Here's the odd fact. In several late Mesopotamian texts, there are references to the days when the gods withdrew to the heavens or retreated beyond the great gates. These phrases are often embedded in poetic laments about the destruction of cities. Historians are still debating whether such lines refer to a perceived loss of divine favour, or if they preserve a more literal tradition, that there was a time when the gods were physically present, and then they left. If the Anunnaki were real, there are several possible explanations for their disappearance. One is that their mission, whatever it was complete. If they came to extract resources, establish certain systems, or guide human development to a specific point, they may have reached their goals and departed. Another possibility is that something forced them to leave, a conflict among themselves, a danger from beyond Earth, or a change in the planet's environment that made it less hospitable to them. There is also the possibility of deliberate withdrawal for political reasons. By the later periods of Mesopotamian history, human civilizations were growing more independent. New empires rose and fell without obvious Anunnaki intervention. The gods, once absolute rulers, became part of a more symbolic framework, invoked for legitimacy rather than giving direct orders. If the Anunnaki's control relied on being perceived as necessary, perhaps they stepped back when they could no longer hold that position without open conflict. Imagine a great council chamber in the last days of their open rule. Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and others are present. The debate is not about humanity's fate this time, but about their own. Do they stay, risking open rebellion as human cities grow more confident and populous? Or do they leave quietly, letting their legends serve as a tool for influence in absentia? The decision is made. They will withdraw, but not entirely vanish from the human mind. Their images will remain in temples, their names in prayers, their laws in the codes of kings. If they withdrew physically, they may have left certain agents behind, humans loyal to them, trained in their knowledge, perhaps even descendants from their own bloodlines. These individuals could serve as keepers of tradition, ensuring that the systems and structures the Anunnaki valued remained in place long after their departure. In the myths, this would become the role of high priests, kings, and scribes who claimed divine inspiration. From a purely historical perspective, the disappearance of the Anunnaki coincides with shifts in power and culture. By 2000 BCE, the political centre of Mesopotamia had moved from Sumerian city-states to Akkadian and later Babylonian rulers. New gods were elevated, old ones adapted to new contexts. Marduk, for example, rose to prominence in Babylon, taking on roles and attributes once associated with Enlil. This process of syncretism diluted the distinct identities of earlier deities, blending them into broader pantheons. But what if this was not just theological evolution? What if it was a deliberate erasure? If the Anunnaki had once been visible, tangible presences, removing the specifics of their actions from the record would make them harder to track. Future generations would inherit only the shadows of their names, disconnected from the real history. There are also tantalizing hints in later traditions. In Hittite myths, for example, there are references to former gods who now dwell in a distant hidden place, separate from the current pantheon. In biblical texts, the Nephilim, sometimes linked to the Anunnaki in modern theories, are said to have been on Earth in ancient days, and also afterward, but their fate is left vague. Such phrasing invites speculation. Did they migrate somewhere beyond human reach, or did they blend into the human population, becoming unrecognizable over time? Some fringe researchers suggest that the withdrawal was not total, but selective. The Anunnaki may have abandoned most of the Earth but maintained contact with certain groups or regions. These chosen could have received continued guidance, keeping alive a more direct version of the old knowledge while the rest of humanity was left to develop independently. This could explain why certain later civilizations, from Egypt to Mesoamerica, appear to have sudden bursts of architectural and astronomical sophistication. Picture a temple in the twilight of the Anunnaki age. The outer courtyard is empty, the altars cold. Inside, a small group gathers in a hidden chamber. A figure in robes speaks in a language no longer used in the streets outside, instructing them in the rites and codes they must preserve. Beyond the city walls, the stars wheel overhead, indifferent to the loss below. By morning, the figure will be gone, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the weight of secrets. If the Anunnaki truly left, their departure marks a pivot in human history. Before, humans could look to the gods for direct answers, whether those gods were divine beings or advanced visitors. After, we were left to find our own. The myths preserve the shape of that absence. They speak of a golden time when the gods walked among us, and of a long, dim age when we waited for them to return. And that waiting, that expectation, may be their most enduring influence. For thousands of years, humans have told stories of a return, of a messiah, of a king from over the sea, of star people coming back to guide us. Whether those hopes are founded in fact or born from longing, they keep the memory of the Anunnaki alive in the human mind, even when their footprints have faded from the earth. If the Anunnaki vanished from the visible stage of history, their story did not. It slipped into temples, legends, and tablets, and eventually into the pages of archaeology reports and the heated margins of academic debate. In dusty libraries and conference halls, far from the Ziggurats where their names were first spoken, the Anunnaki now live in arguments between historians, linguists, archaeologists, and a growing chorus of independent researchers. And while the battles are fought with citations and counterpoints instead of armies, the divide is sharp. One authoritative fact: within mainstream academia, the Anunnaki are universally regarded as mythological figures from the Sumerian pantheon, roughly analogous to the Olympian gods of Greece or the Aesir of Norse tradition. This view is supported by thousands of translated texts in which the Anunnaki are invoked in ritual contexts, appear in myth cycles, and are integrated into the cosmological structure of the ancient Near East. For the majority of scholars, their existence is not a matter of debate, only their symbolic and religious role. Here's the odd fact. While mainstream scholarship dismisses the idea of the Anunnaki as literal beings, it cannot explain away certain peculiarities. The sudden emergence of complex Sumerian civilization without clear precursors, the king list's impossibly long reigns, the presence of detailed astronomical knowledge that seems excessive for a society just emerging from prehistory. These anomalies do not prove anything on their own, but they keep the door cracked open for speculation. Historians are still debating whether such anomalies are simply the byproduct of incomplete archaeological records or signs of something genuinely unusual in Sumer's origins. The fault line between the two camps is as much about method as it is about evidence. Mainstream scholars work within frameworks that prioritize peer-reviewed consensus, stratigraphic dating, and cultural continuity. Alternative researchers often work the other way, starting with anomalies, then building hypotheses that connect them, sometimes across vast spans of geography and time. This difference in approach makes dialogue difficult. Consider the translation issue. Cuneiform is complex and meaning often hinges on context. A single Sumerian word can have multiple interpretations, especially when describing divine or supernatural events. Mainstream translators often choose readings that keep the text within the boundaries of religious metaphor. Alternative translators may choose more literal renderings, producing phrases like descended from the sky or shining chariot that sound less symbolic and more like physical descriptions. The words on the clay are the same, but the lens through which they are read changes the entire picture. Then there's the matter of missing evidence. Mainstream scholars are reluctant to draw conclusions from what hasn't been found, preferring to work with material in hand. Alternative theorists argue that absence can be just as telling, that certain expected finds, such as transitional forms of writing before Sumerian cuneiform, are missing not because they never existed, but because they've been lost, destroyed, or hidden. This suspicion of deliberate omission feeds into wider claims about suppressed history. Picture an academic conference in a modern university. In one room, a panel of Assyriologists presents on the administrative functions of the Anunnaki in temple texts, showing slides of grain allotments and ritual calendars. In another, a smaller group of independent researchers debates whether a specific seal from Lagash depicts a planetary system, including a mysterious 12th body. The two groups rarely cross the hallway to listen to each other. Each sees the other as working from flawed premises, either too credulous or too constrained. Sometimes the fault lines are drawn within the same person. There are archaeologists who privately admit that certain artifacts don't fit the expected timeline, but who present cautious interpretations in public to avoid professional backlash. Likewise, some alternative researchers are careful to ground their theories in as much established fact as possible, knowing that without a foundation in verifiable evidence, their work will be dismissed outright. The tension isn't just about the Anunnaki themselves. It's about what accepting them as historical beings would mean. It would require rethinking human origins, the nature of ancient contact, and the role of myth as a record of real events. It would also raise uncomfortable questions about why this reinterpretation hadn't been embraced sooner, and whether there were social, political, or even religious reasons for resisting it. In recent years, the divide has been sharpened by the democratization of information. Online archives, 3D scans of artifacts and crowdsourced translations allow non-academics to access primary materials once locked in university collections. This has led to new interpretations, some careful and insightful, others wildly speculative, and a growing public appetite for alternative narratives. Mainstream scholars often bristle at this, arguing that complex material is being misunderstood, while alternative theorists see it as proof that the gatekeepers are losing control. One particularly controversial case is the interpretation of the Sumerian word Anunnaki itself. Mainstream etymology breaks it into Anu, sky, plus NR of plus Kaol, Earth, usually rendered as offspring of Anu or those of royal blood from heaven. To most scholars, this is a mythic designation, but for some alternative researchers, the phrase is read almost literally, those who came from heaven to earth. It's a small linguistic difference with massive implications. In the midst of these debates, the actual tablets, the physical evidence, remain silent. They do not declare themselves myth or history. They simply hold their wedge-shaped marks, waiting for interpretation. Perhaps in that sense the Anunnaki have never truly left the human stage. They continue to shape our world, not through decrees from Ziggurats, but through the fault lines in our own understanding. Picture a graduate student working late in a university basement, carefully copying a newly cleaned tablet. The text mentions the assembly of the Anunnaki and the day of their return to the sky. The student pauses, pen hovering, aware that how she translates that line will place her, perhaps forever, on one side of the fault line or the other. This is what keeps the debate alive, not just the content of the myths, but the knowledge that every translation, every interpretation is a choice, and somewhere in those choices the truth, whatever it is, waits for someone brave enough to name it. For centuries, the Anunnaki lived in the quiet pages of clay tablets, their stories the domain of specialists and scattered enthusiasts. But in recent decades, something has shifted. Modern science, with its relentless curiosity, has begun brushing up against the edges of ancient myth, and in that friction, the Anunnaki have started to breathe again. Part of this revival comes from archaeology itself. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and high-resolution drone surveys have revealed structures and landscapes invisible to the naked eye. Ancient canal systems, buried city walls, even hints of earlier unknown settlements are surfacing in the data. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding of Mesopotamia, but it also revives the question: how much of what the Sumerians wrote was allegory, and how much was a record of their lived reality? One authoritative fact: in 2017, a team of archaeologists working in southern Iraq identified what may be one of the oldest known port facilities in the region, complete with large storage areas and complex water management systems. This suggests the Sumerians were capable of large-scale, coordinated engineering projects much earlier than previously thought. To a mainstream historian, this is evidence of human ingenuity. To someone versed in the Anunnaki hypothesis, it might look like infrastructure built under the guidance of advanced beings. Here's the odd fact: some of the most startling support for re-examining ancient narratives hasn't come from archaeology at all, but from genetics. The mapping of the human genome revealed that our species carries traces of interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, long-extinct relatives we once thought separate from us. This proved that human history is not a straight line, but a braided river with multiple channels. Historians are still debating how far back these braids go, and whether they might one day find something in our DNA that doesn't fit any known branch of the human family tree. In the Anunnaki reading, this possibility is tantalizing. If we can confirm genetic mixing between Homo sapiens and other hominins, could there also be evidence, however faint, of contact with something entirely different? So far, there's no verified alien gene in our genome, but the idea has moved from fantasy to at least a speculative space within scientific curiosity. Modern astronomy has also added fuel to the fire. Thousands of exoplanets have been discovered, many in the so-called habitable zones, where liquid water could exist. The statistical probability of life elsewhere has grown in the public imagination, from a remote chance to a near certainty. If life can exist on other worlds, then the leap from life to intelligent life, to visiting life, feels shorter, even if it's still unsupported by direct evidence. Picture a quiet evening in a modern observatory. A researcher sits before a bank of monitors, watching the light curves of a distant star. The data suggests something large and regular is passing in front of it. A planet, perhaps. She knows the odds of finding life there are slim, Yet she also knows that the Sumerians claimed their gods came from the sky. For a moment, ancient myth and modern science occupy the same small space in her mind. Technology has also allowed for the re-examination of existing artifacts. Advanced imaging techniques can read cuneiform inscriptions too damaged for the human eye, revealing lines of text that have been hidden for millennia. In some cases, the recovered words add small details to known stories, a place name, a description, a date. But sometimes they add something stranger, a phrase that seems oddly literal, a reference to a shining vessel or a house that ascends. These small anomalies rarely make headlines in academic journals, but they circulate quickly in alternative history circles, where each fragment is treated as a possible clue. In this way, modern technology doesn't just rediscover history, it redistributes it, bypassing traditional academic gatekeeping and placing it directly into the public's hands, and the public has responded. Online forums, YouTube channels and documentary series dedicated to the Anunnaki and other ancient astronaut theories have millions of followers. While much of this content is speculative or sensationalized, it reflects a growing hunger for narratives that connect modern discovery with ancient mystery. Mainstream scholars often lament this trend, worrying that it distorts the past, but its sheer reach means that the Anunnaki are now more visible in popular culture than at any time since their names were last carved into clay. This revival isn't just about belief, it's about framing. Modern science, intentionally or not, keeps chipping away at the idea that ancient people were isolated and uninformed. We now know they sailed vast distances, traded across continents, and engineered monumental works that would challenge us today. The more we acknowledge their capabilities, the more plausible it seems that they could have been participants, not just spectators, in encounters with something beyond themselves. Imagine a near future where a satellite scan reveals the foundation of a massive, perfectly symmetrical complex beneath the sands of southern Iraq, a structure unlike any known temple or palace. Excavation begins, and deep within, a sealed chamber contains tablets written in a variation of cuneiform no one has seen before. The first translations speak not of prayers or offerings, but of instructions, coordinates, measurements, and references to those who came from Anu. Would that prove anything? Not definitively. But it would collapse the neat wall we've built between myth and history, forcing us to consider the possibility that the oldest stories carry more truth than we've been willing to grant them. Modern tools can't bring the Anunnaki back, but they can remove layers of time that have hidden them. Every satellite pass, every genome scan, every recovered word is a small act of excavation, not just of the Earth, but of our own deep memory. And in that excavation, the Anunnaki breathe again, their voices no longer trapped in clay, but rising into a world that is finally equipped to hear them. By day, museums feel like safe places, quiet, curated, filled with glass cases and placards that turn the past into something stable, manageable. But at night, when the lights dim and the public is gone, those same halls can take on a different character. The shadows seem deeper, the exhibits feel less like neutral displays and more like guardians, silently keeping their secrets. And if the Anunnaki were real, then it's here, in these hushed climate-controlled vaults, that pieces of their story might still be hiding. One authoritative fact: most major museums and national archives have far more artifacts in storage than they have on display. The British Museum, for example, holds around 8 million objects, but less than 1% are ever exhibited at a given time. The rest remain in backrooms and warehouses, meticulously catalogued, often unseen for decades. Here's the odd fact. Archaeologists working in Mesopotamia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries shipped thousands of cuneiform tablets to Europe and the United States. Many were translated and published. Many others were stored without being fully studied. In some cases, tablets have been sitting in museum basements for over a century, their inscriptions unread. Historians are still debating whether this is simply a matter of limited resources, or whether some texts have been deliberately set aside because their contents are inconvenient. Among alternative historians, there are whispers of artifacts that never reach the public at all. These might be seals showing unfamiliar star patterns, reliefs depicting technology that shouldn't exist in the ancient world, or texts with unusually literal descriptions of the gods' sky chariots and glittering weapons. While no reputable curator will confirm such claims, the possibility lingers in the public imagination, helped along by stories from former museum employees who say they've seen things in the vaults that aren't listed in any catalogue. Imagine the scene: a secure storage room beneath a famous museum. Rows of metal shelving stretch into the dimness, each holding sealed boxes marked with excavation dates from long-forgotten digs. A conservator works late, carefully photographing a small clay tablet under infrared light. The faint wedge-shaped impressions become sharper, revealing a line of text that translates to something like, "The assembly departed through the great gate to the stars." She pauses. She knows the museum will likely file it away without fanfare, but for a moment she feels the weight of that ancient sentence pressing into the present. Officially, museums operate under principles of transparency and academic integrity, but in practice, they also operate under political and cultural pressures. Artifacts that challenge national narratives or religious sensibilities can be quietly de-emphasized, placed in storage rather than displayed. In the context of the Anunnaki, such pressures could easily explain why certain provocative pieces, if they exist, are not part of public exhibitions. Some researchers point to cases where artifacts have gone missing entirely. During the chaos of the Iraq War in 2003, for example, the National Museum of Iraq was looted, and thousands of items, including many from Mesopotamian sites, were stolen. While many were later recovered, hundreds remain unaccounted for. This has fueled speculation that some of the missing items were taken not for their monetary value, but for the secrets they might contain. In the conspiracy-tinged corners of the internet, the story grows darker. Here, the suggestion is that there is an active effort to control the Anunnaki narrative, to release the benign myths, while keeping back any hint that they were real, physical beings with advanced knowledge. Whether one believes that or not, it's undeniable that control over the physical artifacts means control over the primary sources of the story. Yet suppression isn't always deliberate. Sometimes it's a matter of interpretation. A curator might see a carved figure holding what looks like a modern device and dismiss it as a symbolic object, never considering it could depict something literal. A translator might soften a phrase that seems too concrete, turning flying vessel into cloud of the gods. The artifact is still there, the text is still published, but the way it's framed keeps it safely within the bounds of accepted history. Picture a locked cabinet in a museum's research wing. Inside are several unremarkable clay tablets, their surfaces dull with age. On the inventory sheet they're described simply as religious texts. But to someone fluent in Sumerian, they might read more like a technical manual, with references to measurements, energy, and gates between worlds. The information is hiding in plain sight, shielded not by secrecy, but by the fact that so few people can actually read it. If the Anunnaki once walked among us, then somewhere in these collections there may be direct evidence, an inscription, a seal, a carving, that would collapse the barrier between myth and history. But as long as such evidence is buried in storage, it exists in a kind of suspended state, present but not present, real but not real. The irony is that modern digitization projects could change this overnight. More and more museums are scanning their collections and putting high-resolution images online. As these archives grow, the chance increases that a determined amateur or independent scholar might stumble across something extraordinary. The vault, in other words, is becoming porous. The shadows in the museum are still deep, but they're no longer absolute. And perhaps that's the quiet turning point. The Anunnaki may not stride out of the vaults in a blaze of revelation, but their story can still seep out, through a photo uploaded without fanfare, through a misfiled translation, through the careful work of someone who sees more than they were meant to. The museum, in this view, is not just a place of preservation, but a place where the past waits for the right eyes to come along. There's a certain silence that hangs over the question of the Anunnaki's fate. For thousands of years their names commanded awe, invoked in prayers, etched in clay, carried across empires, and then nothing. No more grand decrees from Enlil, no more whispered counsel from Enki. Their temples fell to dust, their ziggurats eroded, their worshippers became shadows in the archaeological record. If they were real, physical beings, they left without farewell. If they were myths, they simply stopped being told with the same fervour. Either way, their absence feels intentional, like a door deliberately closed. One authoritative fact: by the late 1st millennium BCE, the old Sumerian and Akkadian pantheons had been almost completely supplanted by new systems of belief. Zoroastrianism in Persia, Hellenistic religion in the wake of Alexander, and later, the Abrahamic faiths. This transition was not gradual in some places. Older temples were abandoned or repurposed, their gods folded into new hierarchies or quietly erased from memory. Here's the odd fact: scattered in later Mesopotamian texts, centuries after the fall of Sumer, are peculiar references to the assembly of the Great Ones, meeting in secret, or the lords who departed to the far horizon, never to return until the appointed age. Historians are still debating whether these are literary echoes of the old myths, or deliberate allusions to something the scribes believed had physically occurred. Among those who entertain the Anunnaki hypothesis, the question is not just why they left, but whether they left at all. Some suggest they withdrew to distant lands, perhaps deep within the earth, or to uncharted regions across the sea, continuing their work away from human eyes. Others imagine they returned to the stars, their great sky chariots vanishing into the darkness, promising to come back when the world was ready, or when it needed them again. And then there are the more unsettling ideas, that they never left, only shifted their methods. In this reading, the Anunnaki became the unseen hands behind human rulers, guiding from the shadows, their influence diffused into secret societies, dynastic bloodlines, and hidden technologies. It's a theory without hard evidence, but it thrives in the spaces where history leaves gaps. Picture a lone shepherd in southern Iraq, standing among the ruins of Ur at dusk. The wind moves through the broken walls like a voice. In the fading light, the Ziggurats' tears are nothing but silhouettes against the horizon. For a moment he thinks he sees something high above, a point of light moving too quickly to be a star, too silently to be a plane, and then it's gone, swallowed by the same sky the Anunnaki were said to descend from. If they were real, their departure would have been the most significant event in human prehistory, a severing of a direct link between humanity and an advanced, non-human intelligence. That absence could explain the long ages of myth and empire building that followed, as civilizations sought to recreate, in their own limited ways, the order and knowledge they once experienced under these beings. But if they were myth, their disappearance is no less interesting. It would mean that a culture chose, consciously or unconsciously, to stop telling the stories that once defined them. Myths die slowly, yet the Anunnaki's role faded quickly compared to other ancient deities. Perhaps the myths were suppressed because they contained ideas someone found dangerous. Or perhaps the memory of the Sky Lords became too dissonant in an age when empires were now ruled by men alone. In the end, the question loops back to us. Why does the idea of the Anunnaki's return hold such power? Is it because we long for confirmation that our ancient ancestors were not as isolated as we imagine? Because we hope that some higher intelligence has been watching and will step in before we destroy ourselves? Or is it because, deep down, we suspect the story of our beginnings is far stranger than the one we've been told? Historians, scientists, and storytellers stand at different points along this circle. The historian searches for patterns in surviving texts, the scientist for evidence in the ground or in our genes, and the storyteller for meaning in the spaces between. The Anunnaki live most vividly in that last space, the place where fact blurs into possibility and possibility into longing. Perhaps that's why their story refuses to die. Even if they never walk the earth as flesh and blood, the Anunnaki remain a mirror we hold up to our own questions about where we came from, who we are, and whether we are alone. And mirrors, unlike myths, don't vanish when the telling stops. They simply wait for someone to look into them, so the door remains. Whether it's carved into stone or set into the fabric of human memory, it stands there in the dark, closed but not locked. Maybe one day it will open again. Or maybe it already has, and we just haven't recognized the figure that stepped through. The night has grown deeper now. The air feels still, as if the world itself has paused to listen. You followed the footprints of the Anunnaki through dust and clay, through temple halls and desert winds, into vaults where the light barely reaches. Whether they were gods, travellers from another world, or simply the taller shadows cast by human imagination, their presence lingers in the spaces between fact and myth. Think of the Ziggurats, their stepped terraces reaching up toward the stars. Once they were crowned with golden shrines and filled with incense smoke. Now they stand alone under the same sky, the constellations unchanged. Somewhere, the same stars that guided ancient priests still drift in their slow, patient courses, marking a time that is far older than any kingdom. You might imagine the Anunnaki as they were described, robed in shimmering garments, eyes bright with knowledge, voices carrying commands that could move kings. Or you might picture them differently, not as rulers, but as quiet observers, blending into the human story until their names wore away like weathered carvings. In the silence of this moment, it doesn't matter which is true. What matters is that the mystery remains. The unanswered question is not a gap to be filled, but a place to rest, a quiet shore where the waves of history wash gently over the mind. So you can let it go now. Let the sands cover thee, footprints again, let the stars wheel on overhead, let the stories settle back into their long sleep. The past will keep its secrets until it's ready, and you don't need to hold them tonight. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, let the last light fade. Good night.